Good evening, members and officers, and welcome to our February meeting of the Policy Development Committee. Firstly, a few housekeeping announcements. Please switch your mobile phones to silent. And those attending virtually, but I believe there are none, switch off your microphone to avoid any disruption during the meeting. The meeting is being recorded. It will be available in due course on the Council's YouTube channel. Reminder for councillors: A, to ensure that those attending virtually can hear the proceedings, please ensure you project your voice and speak clearly. Please remember it is a formal meeting and therefore do not refer to each other by first names. Good. Item 1, apologies please, Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. I have apologies from councillors Hunt, Turton and Wilson.
Thank you. Item 2 is to approve the correct record of the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of January 2024. Happy with those minutes? Anyone going to move? I should move by Councillor Lisa, seconded by.
Can I have a question?
Yes.
On
Go ahead.
on page 21, it's got a thing about the committee receiving an update about the transfer of toilets, public conveniences to direct council. I don't know, did I miss that? And also, there was the following thing on page 22 about update to members about where the council is in terms of the proposed changes to electoral registration.
I don't think we've had one about the PCs, but I might have seen one about electoral registration, I think, somewhere.
I'm not sure about the electoral reg one, Chair. The PTs one, I'm just getting the summary from the property team in terms of where we are with those transfers. Draft heads of terms have been agreed with a number of town and county councils, but they're at different stages in terms of the legal conveyancing. So I've had an email through and just putting that summary together, and I'll have that emailed out to members in the coming days. The electoral reg one, I'm not sure where we are with that one.
In terms of, yeah, there was questions about the service plan, wasn't there, I think, and I know a response has been done internally, so I'll just need to check whether that's actually gone back to members. I assumed it had. I will check.
Okay, thank you both for that. Thank you.
I wasn't about the public toilet thing, didn't I? I just put a query in, didn't I?
That's correct, yeah. So there was a query in terms of where we were with transfer of the toilets to parishes.
I queried whether the parishes had been notified as well as the town councils, didn't I? More or less.
I think your query, Councillor, was about the smaller grants, wasn't it, to the smaller parishes, those that have that annual grant?
There's going to be these, yeah.
So I think there was a couple of updates. One was around the smaller grants, the other was around where we were with the transfer of those over to the parishes. But I'll make sure that update comes out to members in the next week. So.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So we've had a move that we approved.
Madam Chair, there's not a lot about the debates that we had and the discussion that we had. Like, there's not even any notes of anything that was asked. It's just the reports put through, which seems a bit.
The questions are there, the responses are there. I can put in question, answer, right? Formulate the answers.
Okay, that's better. Cool.
We have the move that we accept these minutes as a correct record of the January meeting. Do you second it? Thank you. All in favour? Thank you, members. I have no items under item 3 to bring forward tonight. Are there any declarations of interest under item 4, members? I proceed, Madam Chair. Thank you. Item 5, there's no part B, so we go ahead with part A. And over to John Triggs, please, for item 6.
Thank you, Chair. So
Or is it Tony?
it's going to pass over to Tony, Chair.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. I'm here to present the Q3 performance report. The recommendations are detailed in your report in 2.1 to 2.6 on page 25. Firstly, I'd like to talk you through our revenue budget position. The revenue budget 23-24 was approved at full council on the 22nd of February 23, 14.766 million. The forecast budget surplus as at Q3 is £73,000, and the variances making up this small surplus are shown in Appendix A on page 37. The original budget for 23-24 was budgeted to achieve £250,000 worth of vacancy savings. The current position forecast that will achieve 296,000 known on vacancies to date. The National Pay Award negotiations for 23-24 have now been settled and paid to staff in November's salary and backdated to the 1st of April 23. The pay award works out to be an average of 6.7%. The original budget included 4%, so the additional costs of 436,000 have been funded from the Budget Management Reserve. As at the 31st of December, we are now estimating growth from business rates to be additional £950,000, and we propose to place the additional 950 into the following earmarked reserves: Collection Fund Reserve 450,000, Budget Management Reserve 150,000, Town Centre Management Reserve 200,000, and the Treasury Management Reserve 150,000. The Collection Fund Reserve balance of just over 1.34 million is held to deal with timing differences within the collection fund. The reserve includes just over 912,000 that were utilised in 23-24 and 24-25 to mitigate timing differences of business rate awards in 22-23. And then due to the additional business rate income reported for this quarter, we've increased the reserve by a further 450,000, thus leaving the reserve with a residue balance of 878,000 protection against future volatility. The rateable value of the museum has been reduced down to £1, and this has resulted in a net impact to the council of 228,000. And the Q1 report recommended that this was contributed to the regeneration reserve to fund future projects. Current external borrowing is £3 million, and due to slippages in the capital programme and using cash balances for internal borrowing, we are forecasting a net 274,000 underspend on interest payable. In addition, due to ongoing higher interest rates, the council is also reporting a 380,000 net increase in interest receivable. There's also no anticipated use of the Treasury Management Reserve during 23-24, and the proposed additional in-year contribution of 150,000 can be carried forward to future years to help protect and mitigate against higher borrowing costs. Of the remaining additional business rate income, it's proposed to place 150,000 into the Budget Management Reserve to help protect against future volatility. And it's also proposed to place 200,000 into the Town Centre Management Reserve to support the much valued street marshal service moving forward into 24-25. There's been a drop in sale price of recycling material and recycling credits receivable, totaling 153,000. This is partly mitigated by an increase in the 56,000 shared savings scheme income. We're also under pressure from increased costs and volumes from temporary accommodation, and currently forecasting a 239,000 increase in costs, which has been offset in the year by 194,000 from the additional homelessness grant and 45,000 from the additional refugee grant income. Pay and display car park volumes are slightly lower than in previous years, and we reflected a £78,000 forecast reduction for this year. Earmark reserves can be found in Appendix B, pages 39 to 41. Now moving on to capital. The 23-24 capital programme is attached to the Appendix D on pages 45 to 49. The current 23-24 capital programme stands at just over £17 million. We're proposing variations of 216,000 and £4.6 million of slippages to later years. Variations to the 24-25 programme consists of various reprofiling of budgets and a 562,000 tag bid for Adelaide car park wall repairs. Two projects already approved by full council consisting of 632,000 for additional temporary accommodation in the rear of Balport Street and 500,000 public realm works. The full details of these movements can be found in 4.4.3 of your report on pages 28 to 31. All these changes take the revised capital programme to just under £37 million, and this is funded by 15 million capital receipts and borrowing, 18.9 million external grants, and 2.9 million earmark reserves. The actual spend at the end of December was just under £8.3 million. Release of funds for this course can be seen in 4.8. We have pack on page 32. And then we've got some information on treasury management, debt management, general debtors detailed in 4.5 to 4.7. Also at the end, we've also got Appendix E, which sets out our 5 programmes and the projects sitting beneath them, with updates and progress to date, including budgets and spend to date. The details of these can be found on pages 51 to 85. Members, that concludes the Q3 presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tony. Members, question, please. Councillor Bullitt.
Can't keep quiet, can I? On 4.110, I think it is, the other street marshal scheme, I see there's going to be an update in March. Is there any intention of rolling it out to other towns and parishes, villages? Because like South Molton, we're starting to have issues in South Molton. I don't know whether, obviously, Ilfracombe and wherever.
And North Molten had the same issue with Southern Light, didn't it?
Can you make
What?
comments through the chair?
Apparently,
Mr. Chair.
yeah, there was a serious incident in South Molten. I believe that it started in North Molten and then they travelled to South Molten. So I think it might be nice to.
Yeah, we're starting to get issues in South Molton. Is there any?
Yes, through you, Chair. So the current, the original street marshal scheme started in Barnstaple. The current 6-month extension to that service that came about in September last year and ends in March extended that contract and also rolled out a provision across Barnstaple and Barnstaple and Ilfracombe. So there was an extension into a wider town network. An update report will come to members in March that will set out the success of that scheme. At the moment, there are no plans to roll it out to further towns or villages, but obviously that is subject to member discussion when the report comes in March as to whether you would like that rolled out any further than the current scheme. Obviously, the further it's rolled out, obviously the more that will cost, and obviously the more resource that will be required to deploy that. Obviously, some of the incidents you've talked about obviously happened at night time, where obviously the street marshal scheme doesn't operate 24/7, doesn't operate during the daytime. But obviously the benefits of that scheme have been greatly received, obviously in Barnstaple, where it started in Ilfracombe, but obviously that's subject to member discussion when it comes to your committee in March.
I mean, the incident I was thinking of in South Molton happened at what, 7 o'clock in the evening, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously having street marshals there, you wouldn't have street marshals at 7 o'clock in the
Yeah,
evening.
7 o'clock in the evening.
Councillor Bushell and Councillor Lever.
Yeah, I saw that the MP put out something about the street marshals, and it was worded in a way that it confused me because I thought that we were paying for that, but it read in a way that it could be misinterpreted. I think John that it was all of her doing. So perhaps we could ask our MP for some further funding so we can roll it out to extra towns if she's so pleased about it. And
If I could just provide some context around the funding. So the original funding for street marshals came through the COVID outbreak management fund. So that's when the street marshals were introduced. That was government funding when that was first rolled out. The recent street marshal scheme up until September was funded through the Safer Streets Fund, which obviously was government funding, but obviously the MP was instrumental in getting for the authority. The 6-month extension from September, so that funding ran out in September. The 6-month extension from October to March was fully paid for by this council. And obviously the proposal of putting £200,000 into the town centre management reserve would obviously be North Devon Council money. We are in discussions with other towns, councils around contributions towards potential future schemes. So we've had discussions with Barnstaple Town Council. We've had discussions with Ilfracombe Town Council. So obviously we're open to further conversations with other town and parish councils if they would like to be part of that conversation about the ongoing future of street marshals.
George just stole my thunder. I was going to say this was the project wasn't originally funded through the central government, and as I understand it, was centred on Barnstaple, which is why it started there. And I know that Barnstaple Town Council have been talking to John about carrying on funding for that if the district council aren't able to. I think it's probably something that, that town parish councils could, quite properly take on the funding of, bearing in mind the financial strictures that the district council has got.
Could we ask the police and crimes commissioner to chip in, because it seems a little bit like it's urgent that somebody else is paying for out of their precinct.
Okay, I think we'll move on from that one. Councillor Clayton and then Councillor Jones.
It was just to say something on the last one. Can we still stay on it a minute or not?
Okay.
I think Councillor Bushley is quite right, actually, that we should be putting pressure on the police and crime commissioner. It has been stated that the funding for these street marshals, which I have to say in Barnstaple has gone down with the public really, really well. There's no doubt about that. It did come from central government, but this is the problem with the inadequate way that local councils are funded. They produce this rabbit out of the hat, shall we say, some money through the safest funding project, but it's only for a short period of time. Do these Tory MPs think that crime and social disorder are limited to a period of time? Because they're not. They just sort of dangle it in front of you and they expect the local councils, who are already in problems because of the lack of funding, to carry it on. It just can't. You cannot have this going on over and over again. Councillor Evers said about the Barnstaple Town Council. Hopefully, if the district can't afford it, we'll take this on. It is a much needed resource, but we need to put pressure on the local MP, as Councillor Bushell says. We need to put pressure on the Police and Crime Commissioner, the elections coming up, to say, look, we will guarantee some money for this. No use just talking. I think we should resolve to actually submit some kind of letter to the local MP, to the Police and Crime Commissioner, saying, look, what's going to happen about this funding? Can you get central government to do something? Can we do that?
Can we do that from this committee, John, or not? Would it have to be like a motion at full council to write? Or
You can do it from your committee chair.
Yeah. Well, I would say we send a letter to both the local Conservative MP and the local Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner saying,
right?
are you supporting this? And can we have more? No one's said.
Well, it doesn't seem right that the district council is picking up at something that is quite clearly in the area of its others.
Same subject, councillor Jones?
I've got a different topic, but are we,
Oh, right, okay.
are we moving on it? That was, I think
Finish
that's,
that.
Well,
I didn't know if you wanted to speak on
I think
that.
John seconded it, he beat me to
Yeah,
it.
yeah, right. Is everyone in favour that we write to those two?
And that we ask them for their views, because I'd like to know what they think about that, actually.
Thank you. Councillor Jones?
One was a simple question. Could we just seek some clarity on why parking revenue is reduced? Hopefully simple.
The value, obviously, in terms of percentage against budget, isn't that material. So the overall income budget is around 3.6 million. So percentage wise, that variance isn't that great. So we have seen a slight decline in parking revenue. There has been a reduction in fine income, which obviously in one way could be looked at as positive, because it means that then people are paying for the parking that obviously that they should be paying for. So there has been a reduction in fine income. So we have adjusted the budget moving forwards to account for that. But the percentage of income is a relatively small percentage against the variance of the budget.
Is it like that fine reduction, sorry, appreciate that fine reduction relates to, was that resource issue? But then that's people on the road out. Okay.
No, so
People being better
yeah,
behaved.
it's just people being better behaved. So I mean, there's always a staff resource changeover in the CEOs, but we have got a reduction in resource out there on the ground. They're not just out there to issue fines, they're now trying to be more customer focused, helping people with parking inquiries, etc. So I think that more customer focused approach has been received positively by the public, and obviously that's had a positive impact in terms of less fines being issued.
I think Councillor Maskell didn't have the same experience when she was parked in Barnstaple last week.
John, can I ask you a quick question? It's regarding Taunton. Our clerk has said that she spoke to the officer that was doing something to the machines. I don't know whether it's the tickets or, and he said that he doesn't check the cars anymore. He's not enforcing anything. So obviously that's what.
They are checking the cars.
Are they? Yeah.
So no, the CEOs are out there to obviously to enforce. At the end of the day, they have an enforcement responsibility.
Yeah.
But we are, whereas maybe years ago, that perception was that your CEOs would be out there trying to get as much PCN income as possible. Obviously, that I suppose that has changed in a way. We're trying to get them to be more customer focused, to be sort of looking out for incidents on car parks. Obviously, they're also assessing car parks, making sure that things like potholes are being reported. But their ultimate role is to make sure people are paying for their parking. So if they're not, then obviously they are enforcing accordingly. So yeah, there's certainly been no change to any enforcement rules.
Strange. I'll ask her again to verify that.
Absolutely.
Who's next? Councillor Warden and then Councillor Bullitt.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to vote for recommendations if I'm allowed, but I also would like to ask your indulgence just for a moment. I attended a government webinar this afternoon about auditing of our accounts, and most authorities are struggling at the moment to actually get their accounts audited. And I think members would like to know the situation with regard to our council and how we get them audited and so on, because I think we've got some good news. And I just wanted to give them the opportunity, if you don't mind. It's not strictly on the agenda.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think Chair, Councillor Warden's referring to are there's been a change in terms of the audit of accounts. So you'll recall recently at full council, we presented the statement of accounts that have been audited, and obviously that was our 22-23 financial signed off. We're in a quite fortunate position that we've had 22-23 accounts signed off. A number of councils haven't. We're probably in a small percentage, maybe 10% of the country that have actually had them signed off. Some councils haven't had their prior years of that signed off, even 21-22. I think some even go back to 19-20. So obviously that makes it very challenging then as a council in terms of understanding your real financial position moving forwards in terms of budgeting and obviously your financial standing. So the reason behind that has been one of resource for the major audit firms who do the external audits. What the government are now consulting on are changes to make sure those audits have a line drawn under them. They're putting in a backstop date, and that will be a cut-off date. That means that by a certain date, they'll either have to be audited, or if not, then that will roll forward in a sense to make sure that the next audit that takes place signs them all off in one go. So the government are consulting on that. For us, that doesn't affect us because we're right up to date. We've had 22-23 accounts signed off. The 23-24 accounts obviously will be published this financial year. And then obviously we'll be in a position to move forward with our new external auditors with Bishop Fleming. So the previous auditors we had will continue with some of the authorities. A number of us are moving over to a new firm called Bishop Fleming, who we've met already. And they seem pretty much on it to get our accounts audited this year.
That's great. Thank you, John. Yeah, sorry to bring that up. I thought it was useful because we were told this afternoon that 918 authorities are behind.
Okay, I have.
John must be doing something right.
Councillor Bullitt, I think, was next. Next, but are you on this subject?
Yes, it's about that subject.
Are you okay?
Well, I don't even mind about going back to parking, it's not really.
Right.
I was only going to ask who's responsible for checking the parking machines, because twice I've been in the market car park and it wouldn't take cards, and there was queues of people trying to pay by cards and it wouldn't take them. Do they get checked on a daily basis?
Yeah, they do get checked on a regular basis. So the CEOs, again, that's part of one of their responsibilities, is making sure the machines are working, and if anyone's having problems with machines, they're helping the public with them as well. We did have an issue with the car provider last week where the machines were down for a while in terms of taking car payments.
Mm.
Obviously, we do have alternative measures such as the Ringo app, etc., where people can take payments through alternative measures. But no, the CEOs are there to help people. And obviously, if the car park machines are down, then obviously they'll report that through to the team, who will then make sure that the software provider is contacted immediately.
Twice I've been there, we're frustrated card markers, again.
Katrina.
Yes, just going back to the point raised by Councillor Warden about the audit regime that's being changed. Now, I've listened to many accountants over many years, and they're always very prudent people, and they take a reasonably risk averse type of approach, because that's their job, isn't it? And at the moment, we've got hundreds of local authorities, of which unprecedented amounts are effectively going bust by issuing Section 114 notices. And at the same time, the audit regime is falling to pieces, and the government, presumably ministers in the government, as opposed to accountants in the government, are, from what Mr. Dixon just described, seem to be budging up something to try and make the problem go away. Sorry, can I ask, is that correct? Is that the line I've understood?
I think what they're trying to do, Chair, is draw a line in the sand and say, right, by this date, you must have those accounts audited and be published, or if not, at least publish whatever accounts you have got by that date. I think that the key thing is I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the councils who haven't published their accounts, because obviously councils have to get their accounts done by a certain date. It's then waiting for the external audit to be carried out. So what the government is saying is, okay, by September 2024, they really want to put the line in the sand in terms of the 22-23 accounts, and before saying, well, okay, by that date, any audit work that's been completed, that's the last amount of audit work that will be done. And then that will move then into obviously then 23-24 statements, which will obviously then, in a sense, pick up any of that outstanding old stuff that needs to be picked up as well. But the line in the sand really is to sort of say, well, enough's enough, you must draw a line under it. Otherwise, we'll just keep going on and on and on, and you'll have all of these years outstanding until whenever. And as Councillor Petrino said, you've got councils that are under significant financial pressure declaring Section 114 notices, and obviously they need to make sure that their accounts are up to date and audited and have an opinion on them, because they're making financial decisions moving forwards that obviously will undoubtedly need to be backed up by an audited set of accounts.
Councillor Jones.
Just a quick one, I'm sure we'll get quick assurance, but I trust that we have protection within our contract, that if we run into a situation where an auditor can't deliver, that there's clauses so that we can move to another. But and then when we switch auditor, we don't end up in that, I'm sure that that's not the case, but that we're not going to end up in a similar situation ourselves.
Yeah, so the audit contracts are awarded by an organisation called Public Sector Auditor Appointments. So they issue the 5-year contracts. So our current 5-year contract has just ended with Grant Thornton. And obviously Grant Thornton audited a significant number of public sector accounts. We're moving away from Grant Thornton, so our new 5-year contractor is a company called Bishop Fleming. We're based in the southwest. They are new to doing local authority audits. So this is the first time they have taken on sort of public sector contracts, but they've actually employed a number of public sector auditor staff. So a number of staff in the Audit Commission, a number of staff in Grant Thornton have actually moved across to them. So we've met with them. Some of the staff we recognise from sort of previous audits that we've had with other public sector bodies. So we met with them a couple of times, and we were assured that obviously they're geared up, ready to start the 23-24 statements. They have taken on some clients who've obviously had outstanding audits that haven't been completed by Grant Thornton. So again, we're in a good position that the only year they've got to do for us is the first year, which is 23-24. And they've met with myself and Tony, and we've got the date set in the diary as to when those audits are starting. So I can assure you as much as I can the dates that we've got. We hope that Bishop Fleming will deliver on that. But there are provisions in the contract, such as the ones that haven't done from some of the other audit firms, because obviously if they haven't done some of the audit work, then obviously some of the audit fees will be reimbursed as well. So there are provisions in there. We can't just go and award ourselves a new contractor. We will stay with Bishop Fleming, and obviously at the moment we're assured that they will deliver on the audits they're set out to.
Just on that, if in 2 years' time you still haven't received the first 12 months audit, what can we do at that point? Get a refund, but we don't have to sit with them for 5 years, because that's how it works.
At the moment, the contract is for 5 years, but I think if the new auditors aren't performing after that first 12 months, I don't think we'll be waiting 2 years. I think based on the recent consultation that's gone out and what's happened in the previous audits, I don't think we're waiting that long for action to be taken. So
Presumably there would be exit clauses within the contract because they wouldn't meet what they were agreeing to meet.
there would be with the contract they've got with public sector audit appointments, yes. But providing Bishop Fleming are delivering on that, then obviously there shouldn't be need to go down that route. But if they weren't delivering on it, then public sector auditor appointments would obviously pick that up with Bishop Fleming direct. So we don't contract directly with Bishop Fleming. In a sense, it's the government, it's the audit commission, who were previously awarding that contract to the auditors on behalf of the government.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that.
Chair.
Questions?
Change of subject. On page 53, it's got some stats about empty homes. And I remember about, was it 18 months ago, we started this empty home project. And I know it's quite small because it's because the resources available mean that effectively there's less than one person devoted to it. But the idea clearly was to bring as many empty homes back into use as possible. And it takes ages, of course, I know. But nevertheless, looking at these numbers, it seems that the number of empty homes seem to be going upwards. Is there anything we can do to reverse that trend? Oh, this is the middle one. It's KR8. Number of residential properties that be classed as empty. There's quarter one, 730, quarter two, 755, quarter three, 754. So it's gone up, you know, a big bump in the same.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know the exact answer. I'll have to get that back to you. We can get maybe a report by Fred to give you an update in terms of progress on that project. Would that be helpful for your committee?
It's fine, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
That wouldn't be because Fred's gone somewhere else and Fred's
Members, we've got a mover for the recommendations. Is there a seconder, please? Thank you. All in favour? Thank you very much.
Yeah, was that with your amendments, obviously with your resolution as well?
Yes,
Happy
yeah.
to include that, with- yes, and the seconder, yeah. Are you happy with that, members? Yeah, thank you. That's that, John, yeah. Item 7 is review of fees and charges 24-25.
So Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm here to present the fees and charges report for 24-25. The recommendations are detailed in 2.1, 2.2 on page 87. The guidance this year was to increase some fees and charges by 5%, and some are set by statute and set nationally. Any variations to the 5% I'm going to go through now. So the 5% increase has been applied to the following services: allotments, trade waste, cemetery fees, sports pitches, annual market, pre-application planning fees, and dog waste. Now I'm just going to go through detail the ones that have changed by a different amount. So building control was increased by 6.7%. That's to ensure the income recoups the cost of providing the service and the service remains competitive in the market. Land charges been set to recoup the cost of providing the service. Environmental health fees, we've had 2 changes within this appendix. Got a new fee for film classification certificate and variation to export health certificate in 3.11. Again, both of these have been set to provide a level to recover the full amount of administering the fee. The Pannier Market venue hire, following the recent refurbishment and new facilities from the Pannier Market, we're now offering an enhanced look and feel to the market, and have varied the prices of the venue offer in line with other similar venues. Details on this can be found in Appendix HB. Bulky waste to be increased as follows: up to 2 items, £30, 3 items, £38, and 4 items, £45. This still keeps our pricing in line with our neighbouring authorities. Garden waste charge, an increase of £5 to £60 per annum, giving us a similar charge to other Devon councils and ensures the cost of providing the service is fully recovered by the income. States events licence fee, the licence of both charity and commercial events on council's land has been set to recover the cost of administrating the fee, and this can be found in Appendix M. Then we've got the Estates Contractors Works Licence. This is a new fee for 24-25 for works requiring where they require access or use of our land. And it's set to recover the cost of administering the fee. And then we've got the final one is modification of a section 106 agreement. This is a new fee for 24-25. And again, it's set to recover the cost of administering the new licence fee. And details of this can be found in Appendix O. The net effect of all the changes mentioned result in a net increase in income of £221,000, all of which has been built into the draft 24-25 budget. Members, that concludes the presentation. I'd like to refer you back to the recommendations in 2.1 and 2.2, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Actually, Kate.
Thank you, Chair. 4.7, page 88, multi-waste collections. It seems that the rationale for that is just to bring us up to the same level as neighbouring authorities. I've checked on neighbouring authorities, but those increases seem a hell of a lot compared to the 5% that we're aiming for. And the possible result of this, of course, will be not that they've picked up, but they are dumped. Yeah. And therefore revenue would go down. And I'm just wondering, if there's any other rationale apart from bringing it in line with our neighbouring authorities, which, as I say, I haven't checked. I don't know if that is true.
We can do the check on that. We have checked, obviously, in terms of other authorities and what they charge for bulky waste. The main rationale is to make sure it recovers the cost of actually going out and collecting it, because obviously it's a separate connection. It's obviously in order for the van and obviously the renewals in terms of going out picking up, we need to make sure it's recovering that cost. I think when you compare with what some other providers charge, so for example, if you're having a white goods delivered and then they sometimes will take your old white goods away, but often they won't take it away for free, they will charge you a fee. That often is in the region of 25, 30, 40 pounds in terms of taking that white goods away. So the fee we charge isn't out of sync with what other providers charge, including other authorities. And it is really in line to make sure we're recovering what the actual service is costing us.
Yeah.
Does it covers the cost then? So obviously before
It was,
were we below other neighbouring authorities before? We must have been way below to go up by.
I mean, every authority will obviously review their charges annually like we do. Again, obviously going from, say, £20 to £30. Obviously, it is quite, because the value is quite low to start with, the percentage does seem quite high. Obviously, if you're only putting a 5% increase on there, you're going to be increasing it by a couple of pounds. So we're really trying to make sure it recovers the cost that it does to actually provide the service, and that we're not cross-subsidising it with obviously other parts of the council.
Yeah, can I just ask a quick supplementary on that? Because what we haven't got here is the actual figures that come in money-wise. How much money comes in from bulky waste? And I don't know how many people use it. It's not new to me now, but I'll be interested to see this time next year whether that figure, because when you presumably you then budget according to those increases, do you? You think based on what we got this year, we're putting it up 38%, 30%. So therefore, our budget should be up 30%.
We used to get one free, didn't you, John?
So, I mean, years ago, you did used to get, there was one that was free, it was free. First one was free.
Well, included in your council tax, it wasn't free.
Well, yeah, obviously it was included, it was obviously, it wasn't separately charged for in addition to
Directly paid.
the charge. So I'm just seeing if it's shown separately in the budget, but I don't think it is. It comes in as part of domestic waste income. So we can get the income figure that generates.
I'd be interested to see that, because I've got no idea how many people actually use that service.
Yeah, it's not considerable. But ultimately, I say it's just about making sure it covers its costs. But certainly the level of income budget would have then been uplifted in line with the percentages that we built into here. So obviously it varies between how many items people have. So we put 30% of the budget, but obviously it varies. So there'll be an average amount applied to uplifting that budget. But we can get
people have to go out as well, don't they?
Yes.
To do it.
Yeah.
But 2 members of staff.
Some of these items are quite.
Maybe a special jury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A discount.
Can we do a discount first?
Just into context, I did go to use the service a couple of months ago. And I looked at what it was compared to what I paid a few years ago, and and I looked at it in comparison to how much it would be for the person that was delivering my new items to take it away. And it was, I remember just thinking, God, that's really expensive. And in the end, I ended up sticking it in the car and doing it myself. And I have very little time to do things like that myself. So in the context, it did seem right. Can I make a recommendation that for the next meeting, we could see a comparison to surrounding districts, how that relates, and perhaps also some other companies to see how that relates to because I share Councillor Clayton's concerns, and I have noticed, particularly in our ward, an increase in things just being dumped. I don't know if that's actually relatively true, or I'm just noticing.
No, I think
So it feels like there is more.
Flight tipping.
Yeah, Chair, it's not just dumping, it's also, I've noticed an increase in settees and mattresses just being in the garden. People not phoning up to collect it, presumably because it's too expensive. I know some authorities do have a sort of amnesty, and they will have a month of free pickups. Maybe that's too much, I don't know.
I don't know how do we compare with sort of the self-employed chaps that go around with their little truck and do it? You know, small businesses, I don't know what they charge.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got those figures with us tonight. They said, no, the team have done that when they've assessed what we need to charge. They obviously look at two things. They look at obviously what the service is costing in terms of our manpower, our vehicles, etc. Do then the charges align with what others are? Because like I say, if you put the charges up too much, then potentially you could then lose business. And I think the key thing, obviously, this will need to go through full council for your formal ratification as part of the fees and charges. So rather than bringing it back to this committee, it might make more sense when we present it to full council, but you also have the summary of what other councils and other providers are charging. So you can make that judgment when you approve or not approve the full council next week.
When we collect these, we just take them to the Devon County Council tip, don't we? Because I've raised this before, that it's not joined up thinking that we have to do the fly tipping, yet DCC can close all of their tips, so it's not convenient to get them. We have to collect the white goods and then I would guess take it to, it would be logical for it to go to the DCC tip. Why aren't DCC doing this? Why are we having this weird overlap? It doesn't feel like the picking up of large white goods is really our remit, although it may legally be our remit. I think they should be doing it. They're the ones who are cutting all the services, making it harder for you to be able to take your stuff to their depositories.
Yeah, it's about the same thing. As far as I'm aware, I might be wrong, this is the discretionary service, we haven't got to offer it. So in my view, if we are going to offer it, it ought to pay for itself. So we need to make sure that whatever we charge covers the cost of the building. And irrespective of whether we did it and if it was free, we'd still get, I know we would get probably less, but we still get fly tipping. And that is a separate issue. And I know it must be an absolute nightmare trying to get money out of a landowner, you know, because you picked up a sofa off their land and they should really have got rid of it, but you didn't, you know, all that stuff.
So John, you're suggesting you would combine it with
Yes,
full council?
well, the full council agenda will be published tomorrow, so I don't think we'll have it done for then. But what we'll do is we will summarise what the other providers and other local authorities are charging, and have that emailed out to members
Thank you.
in advance of next week's full council, so that you can see that when you're then making the judgment as to approve fees and charges at full council next week. So we'll I'll ask Tony to get the team to summarise what other providers are charging, plus also what other local authorities are charging, just to make sure that we are aligned to that. But as Councillor Katrina said, the key thing is that we are ensuring we're recovering the cost and we're not cross-subsidising it to those that aren't then using the service.
It's not the interrupt.
Councillor Bushell, did you want to make a final?
It sounded like we've sort of finished with that topic, so I was going to move us along. If
Oh, right.
I may.
Thank you.
Is that allowable?
Are you going to move the recommendation as they?
Oh, no, I'd like to look into another area of this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought we'd finished.
When you say
talking about-
moving on, no.
No, I'd like to move on to a different section.
Go ahead.
I'd like to have a little further detail on the modification of the 106 agreements. I think that members here have experienced this. It seems that pretty much every big housing estate puts in 106, then they go, oh, we can't do that stuff. And it seems to be par for the course. It's not often that you don't get a 106 agreement modification. And I wondered, I think in planning, we're not allowed to make a profit, are we? But I think this particular one on larger scale developments, not only do we spend a lot of time on this, and it uses a lot of officer time, and I would hope that we build into this cost the fact that we might be using agency staff to do that. Also, the burden it puts on the town and parish councils, with them looking at these again. And I would think that for a 106 agreement, which would only apply for, is it more than 9 houses? That we have a sliding scale on this to try and discourage developers from intentionally saying, yes, we're going to do all of this. And then when they get their planning, they say, sorry, we're not going to do any of that anymore because it's not affordable for us to do this. I feel like that if we're allowed to, we should be able to scale this up a little bit to get rid of the additional work that's being forced onto our planning department, almost just as a matter of procedure. I feel like the number of modifications that come through, it's almost a strategic move by developers. The original agreement, they probably think, well, we're going to change that anyway. And it will be better use of our officers' time, especially as we understand that there's a staffing shortage in that area, if we make the penalty higher for modifications of 106. So then our officers can be dealing with more planning applications rather than a lot of time on what could come across as just a game of chess by the developers versus planning. If I'm allowed to say that, and is that acceptable to say it in that way?
Tracy's had a look at, obviously the level of charges that there's not many councils actually charge modification of 106 agreements. So a lot just absorb it within their current budgetary provision. So this is a new charge that's come forwards, something that we haven't charged for before. She's looked at obviously what others are charging. I think Cornwall Council she compared with who are charging with something similar. So it's trying to set a fee that is relative to the amount of work involved. I think if you set it too high, then potentially you could be seen to be profiteering over above the amount of time involved in terms of modifying a 106. That's not to say you can't have more modification charges each time one comes in. So once modified, it's modified again. You could obviously charge a second time. So it's trying to have a charge that is, I suppose, setting the context of the level of work that's involved.
Could I come back on that? So if we're looking at what's the term for our short-term staff within planning? We have a term.
Agency.
We don't use agency, we use intermediary. So if we're using an intermediary member of staff to do a 106 agreement change, the charge which you're putting in here would give them 2 days of their hours for the entire modification of that. And it seems actually that it probably, looking at the scale and the documents that they have to go through, all of the affordability documents, that 2 days of an officer's time it's going to take longer than that. And then we have to have an officer which sends things back out to the parish councils. I think that we should have a look at this again, because it is quite often intermediary staff that we do use for this. And they may be very efficient with their time, but I think they're probably wasting more than 2 days on a 106 modification. And then obviously we then got to go back to the non-planning staff for them to into 106 and adjust it, haven't we?
The aim is that we're not using agency staff in terms before. The aim is that we're only using agency staff when we really have to. So we haven't got that level of agency staff in planning anymore. The level of fee that's charged is reflective, obviously, of the planning officers that are doing the work. The majority amount of a cost would be the legal team on top. And obviously that's why we've asked for legal fees to be added on top separately. So it's a core £750 to reflect the amount of work that the officers would be doing. Plus then we would recharge any legal costs on the top. So if our internal solicitors are working on it, we would recharge their time on top, and a significant amount of the work would be done by the legal team. The 750 is reflective of a range of planning officer time spent on the modification of 106. It's not saying, well, it's this officer or it's that officer. It's reflective of how much work would need to go into modifying the 106 agreement. I think if you set it too high, potentially we could be challenged in terms of trying to make money on the back of modification of 106 agreements. But I can ask Tracy to provide you a breakdown of the level of work that's involved by the officers. That's separate, and as I say, to any legal work that's done, because the legal costs we would recharge separately to the developer on top of the 750.
Okay. Councillor Jones and Councillor Reading.
Yeah, I just want to thanks for bringing it up, because it wasn't necessarily your point I was going to bring up, but just from the conversations, I'm actually quite concerned, and how much thought has gone into this, because I've just been dealing with a modification of a 106, a very, very minor amend, in relation to land that was being sold for a Class Q, very small, very domestic, but a tiny, but something came up, historic, and that has required a minor amend of 106. It's held up the sales, it's caused all sorts of issues. If he had to pay £750 on top of that, I think I'd be getting more than a one call every 3 days. I'd be getting a call every few hours, maybe. It doesn't, that doesn't make sense. That makes sense if it's a developer making a major amend, but if it's the farmer that's selling a barn, a few meters are impacted by a historic 106, which needs to be amended, which is being amended. The £750 suddenly seems
It's a blanket
illogical.
charge, isn't it? It's not.
Councillor Jones then makes the point that I did at the beginning say that it should be on a sliding scale, because we know that the fee for a Class Q is around £300, I think. So therefore it wouldn't be correct to charge for the amendment to be 750 when the Class Q application is 300. My comments
I
were
assume that's
to
been
large
thought of, and there's already provision to pull that in. Yeah.
Is it possible to look into that, John?
We will look into that, because obviously Tracy's put this forward, obviously as a new fee,
Yeah.
but obviously there'll be some parameters around when that fee is charged and under what regime. So I don't think we have that detail.
Could I add some information to that bit? I don't know if this is still the case, but I know that the church was, if they were selling off buildings in times gone by, and they sold off a building, a church, say, to be split into 3 units, there would be the section 106 would be one of those 3 units, say, would have to be a key worker dwelling. And again, I don't think that this fee is aimed at that sort of development. I think it is, as I'm talking, the large developers, because I think quite rightly Tracy's probably thinking we're spending a lot of time on this thing, which seems to happen on pretty much every large developer's application. And I do apply in the wider sense bit. I think it's correct, but we do need to, I think we need to have a look at these smaller things. So maybe if it's above 5 units, above 10 units. And then we say if it's more than 30 units, and then we can start scaling. So if there was a really big development where they're trying to get rid of all of the affordable houses, and we're going to spend a lot of time trying to justify why that's not right, then they would probably. Yeah, I think we need to have a calculation for this, John, rather than just a straight number.
Yeah, I'll get the detail that Tracy sent through, because like you say, there's some context behind this around when that fee would be charged. So I think what we do is we'll get an update from Tracy, she'll provide a summary, and we'll get that out to members alongside the other query around bulky waste as well, so that you've got that context as to when that charge would be actually made, and what rationale.
Yes, thank you, John.
Yeah, I was basically going to say something very similar to what John has just said, because I think this is the start to look at this particular problem. With regard to 106 situation, it's really only on the larger applications anyway that we're basically talking about, not these little ones.
It's not small ones.
That's right. And it won't apply to that many in a year anyway. Plus the fact that we've got the legal fees on top of the £750. I think this is something that we can go with at the moment and investigate how it goes, basically.
Yeah, we'll pick it up with Tracy. Say the email that came through when she sent it through was that she was looking at what some others were doing. Some weren't charging at all, but Teambridge and Isles of Scilly both charge a fee for one application at 106. Teambridge currently charging £750 per application. But
So could we make sure that there's a caveat in there that it can be officially challenged if, sorry, could we put something in there that there's a caveat that it can be challenged if it's one of these smaller things where it's just all the water like a house?
Councillor Lieber.
I think, bearing in mind, this is the first year that we're charging for it.
Yes.
And it's a small amount of money, relatively speaking. It affects a very few applications. I mean, I'd like to move that we accept these changes to the fees and charges. This could be monitored over the year, and then if it isn't working, if we're spending too much time on it, or on the other hand, if we find that we're penalising small developers too much, then it can be altered next year. But at the moment, we don't know anything at all. So I'd like to move this as it is.
John, it would be reviewed in 12 months anyway, wouldn't it? In your fees and charges, or not necessarily?
see, they'll come to full council next Wednesday for the formal application, and
It
then
goes through that.
set years. Obviously, they'll be monitored through the year
Yes.
in terms of volume and obviously are we charging enough, and then they'll be reviewed again in terms of then what we set for 25-26. But that's not to stop a further review happening through the year. All of a sudden, you felt you were under recovering something, you could bring a report back and amend your fees and charges through the year as well if you felt fit.
Okay, thank you.
I will second Councillor Lever's proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan. Councillor Jones?
I understand your point of move, but let me just reaffirm what I'm saying. Sorry.
Councillor Bullock, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I asked the range something.
Let Peter finish his sentence. And then-
It's just, there are examples of very, very small minor amends. The assumption is that they wouldn't be included. Can we just see assurance that that is the case?
Yeah. These are where staff are having to spend a considerable amount of time, and obviously then you've got considerable legal team on top of that. This is to make sure that we're recharging in those situations, but we'll get that context from the planning managers to confirm that to you, to make sure that's clear when you're approving them.
Maybe a major applications, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she-
Councillor Bullock.
Right. This is, I mean, I was going to bring it up a bit earlier under the previous one, but actually it's probably more relevant to the fees. The BNG plus 10% is coming this morning, isn't it?
Yes.
And obviously the net gain, which is for any development over 10 houses, has to have it plus 10%.
That's very good.
Yeah, and we had the presentation a couple of months ago. I'm a bit concerned about it because I don't see anything here about any fees being charged for it, but I just wonder who is actually going to calculate the fees, calculate what actually credits and things they have to have, who's going to work? Is the planning officers going to do it? Is it building control? Or is it an outside body going to do it? How will it affect the finances of the district council? Because it's going to be a big job for them to do. And under 10 houses comes in April, isn't it? You know, it's a lot of work to be done on that one.
Yeah,
Is it Maxim?
it was need to be March 14th, yeah. Obviously, the planning fees themselves obviously are set by statute. And obviously they have been reviewed, so there's been an increase on planning fees that's come in December. Any further changes to fees, then certainly in that area, they go through March too.
The mark himself will do the lot, will it?
Yeah,
Because the fees
I
is
don't
a
have
lot
I
of work
do
to
turn
do.
up that area, so they say without speaking to Mark, I need to chat with him to understand that bit more context.
And in the presentation we had, they were on about Habitat banks, where you can buy, the developers can buy credits off Habitat Bank. And I was just wondering, we as a district council have got Frank Marsh, which to me is an ideal place to set up as a Habitat Bank, for people to buy, developers to buy credits for 30 years. But it could be an income stream for the district council, I was thinking. Is that anything being thought about that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. It's just a way.
It was highlighted at the meeting, but obviously the carbon bank being, sorry, not carbon bank. The location being explored was a farm.
Yeah, that's one near us, I know it is, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, then members, we've got a proposer and seconder with a couple of, that caveat, and a couple of things I would just be sent out to members. Are you happy to?
We're gonna have Tracy's going to give us a briefing before we vote at council.
I'm going to have a brief one, Chair. Now, what you'll have is you've asked a couple of questions around the fees and charges, one around bulky waste.
Yeah.
And a comparison of charges from other providers and local authorities. And then obviously some clarity around the charging that Tracy's put forwards, just to give you the context as to when that is charged under what rationale.
And
Will
that's
we
where
be
you're-
able to ask her questions at council?
Tracy won't be at full council,
Okay.
but obviously we will send that out to you. If you want further clarity before full council, then obviously you're quite right, you can either ask that prior to council or at full council, where obviously we will hopefully provide you those answers.
Sorry, John, but you didn't actually answer my question, whether it's going to cost the council more for you to do these BNG things. It's going to affect your
Quite organisation, I guess, isn't it?
Don't know, I've not been involved in that side, I
Yeah.
don't know that answer.
I mean, it looks like there's a lot of work involved for the staff you've already got.
I don't think there's any funding that comes with all this, the new plans and regulations.
And no means to.
We have had some small grant funding with BNG, but only small amounts, not much. It was slightly more than that, I think, about 50K, I think it was.
Members, I'd like to take a vote now, all in favour? Members, thank you very much. We now move on to item 8. I'm happy to receive Councillor Helen Walker, who's going to give us an introduction to the budget. I'd like to call it Helen, or?
Yeah, good evening, members. I just want to give you some of the budget highlights that I've picked out from the presentation that John is about to give you. This council has a legal duty to prepare a balanced budget. We've managed to do this despite unforeseen pressure on the budget due to a higher than expected pay award, the ever decreasing in real terms grant funding from central government, and like everyone else, the pressure caused by unexpected high inflation. The budget process started last summer, which included a cross-party workshop in the autumn. These workshops are crucial to address the financial challenges moving forwards. We as a council have responded to the government consultation on grants. Rural authorities are still the poor relation to urban authorities. Urban councils will receive an average 37%, that equates to £142 per head, compared to rural authorities in relation to government-funded spending power. As a result, rural councils have had to increase council tax to balance the books. On average, residents in rural areas will now pay 20% more, about £113 in council tax per head compared to those in urban areas. The decision to buy Green Lane Shopping Centre in 2021 is continuing to show a good positive return whilst protecting a strategic asset. We have been fortunate that the old Wilko store was replaced quickly by Poundland and that the spare space has been used for pop-up shops, both whilst the market was undergoing refurbishment and in the lead up to Christmas. A council hub within the centre will enhance our customer service interface, utilising a unit that is hard to let due to its awkward shape and size. The hub will provide a face-to-face council services in an easy-to-reach space. It is fully accessible to all with good bus links and parking. The hub will be offered to other organisations who also wish to have an accessible town centre presence. We have allocated £200,000 to an earmark reserve to enable the continuation of much valued street marshals. That was discussed a little earlier. Our homelessness services are under extreme pressure. Providing temporary accommodation has doubled in cost since 2020 due to pressure and availability of housing. Buying our own properties for temporary housing is mitigating some of the pressure, but not enough to avoid the need to buy in extra. We have had some nights where we've had over 70 units of temporary accommodation in use, and that is a lot. The uncertainty of the Fair Funding Review, which we are now projecting will be in 2 years' time, makes planning the medium-term financial strategy challenging. All members need to address this in the short to medium term to tackle the challenges we face. I would like to congratulate John and his team on producing a budget in difficult financial circumstances without having to make any cuts to our services.
Thank you, Councillor Langford. Okay, so members, I'm just going to give you a presentation on the budget details. There's a lot of paperwork within item 8, and I'll refer to some of these.
I'm going to all off by heart, John.
Fantastic. I will. Do you have a test at the end? I will refer to some of those appendices and pages within your agenda papers this evening as well. But hopefully the presentation will give you the context of the budget and the context behind it. So I'm just going to talk about the national picture first before we get into the local numbers for North Devon. The draft finance settlement was announced by government just before Christmas. That set out the level of grant funding to local authorities. If you can see that on the board, it's about £64 billion worth of funding provided to local government for 24-25. That's an increase of just under 4 billion from the year before, which equates to an increase in spending power of 6.5%. That's across the whole local government sector. That differs depending on what type of authority you are, and also includes your ability to raise your council tax. So that's not 6.5% of new money from government. That includes the level of council tax that you're allowed to raise for the next financial year as well. So there are some increases within those numbers, and there are some grants and things that are coming out and get rolled in as part of the core government funding. But in a nutshell, the 6.5% of increased spending power, but that doesn't include your level of council tax that you can raise. In terms of that core spending power since 2015-16, this graph just shows obviously that level of spending power has increased, but the makeup as to how that grant is distributed to authorities and how the income comes in does differ. So the blue-green bit at the bottom is council tax. So obviously each year local authorities have increased their level of council tax. So undoubtedly that's increased the level of money that can come into local authorities. However, what we have seen is the red block in the middle. That's the level of what they call settlement funding assessment. That's the level of grant from government. That block's actually got smaller. So even though the core spending power has increased, there are a number of years where the level of resources coming to local authorities decreased in terms of government grant funding. And as we can see, back in 2015-16, the amount of grant coming from government was about half of the makeup of the settlement. Whereas now a large proportion of that is coming from council tax. There's an increased level of this purple block, which is the level of social care grants. So government have given more money into the social care sector over the last few years. And then the level of core grants coming to councils like ourselves have actually shrunk and got smaller. So it's important to understand that when we talk about core spending power, because obviously the makeup and level of funding coming into councils has obviously altered over the financial periods. In terms of then how much of that is made, the overall core spending power by element, as you can see there, over 50% of the money now comes from council tax, whereas obviously back in 2015-16, it was a lot lower, below 50%, but there was this large chunk of grant and not much in terms of other grants, whereas that funding picture has changed, and we now see a bit more money going into the social care sector, and obviously a smaller amount of money coming to councils like ourselves through the full grants. How does that vary by region as well? So 6.5% was the draft settlement before Christmas. The final settlement has now been announced, and I'll touch on that shortly. But the 6.5% that was announced just before Christmas also varies depending on which area you're in. So in some areas it's slightly higher than 6.5% in London and the East Midlands. Down in the southwest, the equivalent of the 6.5% is actually 6.3%. So it's slightly lower in the southwest compared to other areas of the country. The level of CPI inflation had reduced as we went through 2023 and was actually at 4.6% in October 23. When we did this comparison last year, we were looking at double-digit inflation and a much lower core spending power increase. So the figures have changed slightly since 12 months ago when we presented this to members for the 23-24 budget. It also varies depending on what type of authority you're in as well. So the 6.5% is the average across England. We are a Shire District Council, and the amount of core spending power for Shire District Councils was actually lower than 6.5%, it's 4.9%, because obviously some of the upper tier authorities can put their council tax up by a further couple of percent for the adult social care preset, whereas obviously Shire District Councils haven't got that ability, we can only increase up to 3% council tax. For North Devon Council, our draft settlement was actually 4.7% increased core spending power. So actually we were still slightly lower than the average for all Shire District Councils. That was the draft settlement just before Christmas. Last Monday, the government announced the final settlement, and they did announce a little bit of extra money for the local government sector. They increased the social care funding across the country by a further £500 million. That doesn't affect district councils, so obviously it's welcomed by the unitaries and the upper tier authorities, but that doesn't obviously come to district councils. They did announce an increase of £100 million on the draft settlement for local authorities, and some additional funding through the Rural Services Delivery Grant, about 15%, and an increase on the Funding Guarantee Grant. And I'll talk about those numbers shortly in terms of what impact that's had for us when I talk about the draft budget. The draft finance settlement obviously was announced just before Christmas. The final settlement was approved last week. So the budget papers that will come out for the full council meeting next week will incorporate the latest final settlement announcements. But I'll talk about those numbers shortly. So the key announcements in the draft settlement announced that revenue support grant and baseline funding for North Devon Council, we saw an additional 119,000. The rural services grant for the draft settlement stayed the same for 23-24, so no increase at that stage. New homes bonus grant of 351,000, which was slightly less than 23-24. A small services grant of 19,000, which had reduced from 23-24 by 102,000. But then the government readdressed that by giving a funding guarantee grant to say, well, actually, even if some of your grants you get go up or go down, we will ensure you get at least a 3% increase on your overall grant funding. So they announced something called a funding guarantee grant, where we've been given £1.4 million for 24-25. That's £300,000 more than what we were given in 23-24. Once you add all those together, that gave us a net additional amount of £202,000 worth of extra grant funding for the 24-25 because we put the council tax up. So the draft consultation was announced in December alongside the draft settlement, and that ran for a month until the 15th of January. We responded to that and set out a number of the points that Councillor Walker alluded to earlier, such as urban councils receiving significantly more in government funding than rural councils, and we feel that's unfair. the amount per head of population was around £140 per head more going to urban authorities than it is to rural authorities. And as a result of that, rural authorities are having to pay more council tax. There are a number of questions on the consultation for draft settlement. We've responded to all of those, and that's set out in your budget papers in Appendix F on pages 191 to 194. So there's a number of questions asked. We've responded, setting out this council's response to the draft settlement. What the draft settlement also announced was the level of council tax that we could raise and what we could increase up to. So the draft settlement announced that we could raise up to 3% or £5 on an average band D. For us, 2.99% equates to an increase of £6.11. So the draft budget proposes an increase on the council tax of 2.99%, which would yield an additional 214,000. In addition to that, the increase in the tax base that you approved at your last council meeting increases the level of council tax income by around 73,000. Just to put in the context though, the last slide where I talked about the extra grants that we've been given for 24-25 and the increase in council tax, you add those all together, it comes to about just under £500,000. Tony talked about earlier about the increased inflation pay award for staff that increased the budget for 23-24 by a further 460,000 over and above our budget. Therefore, the extra money for next year only really covers the increased costs that we've seen in 23-24 because that increased pay award will go into the 24-25 budget as a starting point. So therefore, that's before any potential pay award for 24-25, which we budgeted for at 4%. But if we see a similar pay award this year of averaging 6 to 7%, then potentially that's another £500,000 pressure potentially for the budget for 24-25. With inflation starting to come down slowly, we would hope that 24-25 pay award is slightly less than what it was for 23-24. Obviously, from a staff perspective, it's nice to see higher pay awards because obviously we've struggled in terms of retention and recruitment in certain sectors, but obviously it has a budgetary impact in terms of the inflationary pay awards. The business rates is another source of income for the budget. We build in retained growth, and that's the growth on the business rates baseline that we've seen since 2013 and 2014. At the moment, we've built into the draft budget around £3 million worth of retained growth. That's made up of £2 million worth of growth in rateable values since 2013-14. So, for example, if we have a new supermarket in town, like we saw Asda came in a few years ago, the rateable value and rates on the new Asda is around £1 million. We get to keep half of that growth in the business rates rateable value in the way that works with the retained business rates income. We also get to keep 100% of any renewable energy schemes and their business rates, and that's an additional 700,000, plus we're part of the Devon Way pool, which yields us about £300,000 a year on top of the baseline funding. So overall, that business rates income is about £3 million worth of extra income over and above the baseline funding. That's been factored into the 24-25 budget. So the challenges we face in terms of the budget moving forwards and the current budget, back in 2010-11, the net budget for the authority was 15.5 million. In 23-24, the current year, that's at 14.7 million. So you might look at that and think, well, it hasn't come down that much. What's all the fuss about in terms of local authority accounting and local authority budgets? But actually, if you add inflation onto those 2010-2011 figures, that budget alone would be around £23 million in today's money. So actually, it's quite a significant reduction in terms of net budget position. Alongside that, we've seen a reduction in our workforce from around 530 full-time equivalent staff down to 440. So about a 20% reduction in workforce. That's all been done naturally. There's been no compulsory redundancies, but obviously that's the only way we can meet those significant budget reductions over the 2010 period up until the early 2020s. We've still got uncertainty around the local government funding model because we're only getting 1 year settlements. We don't know what 1 year to the next is going to look like. There's a general election this year, so we don't know what the funding position is really going to look like for 25-26. We're assuming a rollover of a 1 year settlement again because any government coming in is not going to have time to do any fair funding review for 25-26. And therefore, we're assuming a 1 year settlement for this time next year, with a major funding review likely for 26-27, where any new government coming in will look at a fair funding model for the following financial year.
So
Could you justify the word fair in that context? Because I'm really struggling. It doesn't ever seem to be fair. They got a glossary at the end of their manifesto telling us that fair just means helping out their mates in London and big cities.
Do you want me to answer that, Chair?
I think
It's got
we're,
you 2 minutes.
I'd be amazed if you could.
I think the comment stands, but let's move on.
We do have Adam here.
Sure, we.
Adam's for legal though, isn't he? Can you justify how they can
Through the
use
chair.
that word?
Yeah.
Through
Come
the,
on.
sorry, through the chair. Adam, do you know a way legally that the government can use the word fair in their funding thing?
It's the,
It seems a stretch at best.
Joe, without going into too much detail, the government have been talking about readdressing the funding model for quite some years now, because of allocation and how much money goes, like we talked about earlier, about money going to rural authorities, urban authorities, how much is going to upper and lower tier authorities. The fair funding review is supposed to readdress that balance and make sure that the needs assessment are taken into account for sparsity and rurality, etc. So we don't know what that's going to look like in terms of how the cake's going to get cut up, but what we hope is that it readdresses some of the imbalances that we've seen and we talked about earlier in terms of the fairness of rural versus urban authorities. So
Can we make assumptions that it will be fair if it's a fair funding thing?
if it's called fair funding, I would like to think it's.
A bit like levelling up should be mean levelling up as well.
I just not go there, man. Just leave it. We all know what you're talking about. You need.
But surely they should carry on the words that they use.
So the challenges we've touched on earlier, again, Councillor Walker talked about our increased costs in terms of temporary accommodation. We've tried to mitigate that as much as we can in terms of the budget position moving forwards. We currently budget for 60 households in temporary accommodation per night. That has a net cost to our budget of 276,000. At the moment, those numbers are increasing to around 70, 75 households per night. So that's an increased cost in the current position of around 240,000 over and above the current budget. That's mitigated in the current year, and Tony's report he presented earlier talked about that being offset by some additional grant we've had in the current year. That additional grant is only one-off money in the current financial year, so we don't know what that's going to look like moving into 24-25. However, we have tried to mitigate that by buying our own housing stock for temporary accommodation. That number has increased, as we can see there, the total number of tenancies compared to how much of that has been done through our own stock has increased from 11% to 31% in the current year in 23-24. And we've commissioned to buy more properties this year, so that number should increase as we move into 24-25. So that has gone away to mitigating against that potential increase in homelessness impacting the council budget. Some authorities have seen their costs spiral out of control in temporary accommodation. This authority had the good measure to start buying houses early. A couple of years ago, they built into the capital programme to buy more houses, and that's starting to have a positive impact because that is keeping some of that cost under control, albeit hopefully it won't increase exponentially moving forwards. But that is a risk. The risk of those volumes presenting could increase further than the 70, 75 that we're seeing. We've also got the potential risk of the refugee schemes. Obviously, they're currently covered through grant funding, and obviously there's household placements, etc. But as we move into future financial years, there is risk potentially that some of those placements could break down, and obviously that is a risk then to the homelessness budget as well. I did put on there the risk of Devon County Council removing the 18+ homelessness provision. But obviously, Devon County Council have actually put some money back into their homelessness budget following the additional funding that was announced through the final government assessment. So that has obviously helped in terms of mitigating that risk. But again, that was a risk when we were putting the budget together, but there was potentially a further couple $100,000 that could have impacted us. I don't know if that's going to go away into the future, because again, that funding that comes in is really only probably helping for next year. We don't know what that's going to look like for following financial years. So that risk is still pertinent, because I think even though it's not necessarily going to hit 24-25, it might hit a following financial year, especially with the county council's funding challenges that they have as well. So the medium-term financial strategy that was approved by members who were here back in February 23 set a balanced budget for 23-24. We identified a budget gap for 24-25 of £500,000. That was increasing the following year in 25-26 to around 3 million. And that's down to the level of grant funding we felt was going to be removed from the council budget due to the business rates being reset as part of the fair funding review. That was refreshed in October, and at the cross-party budget workshop, we presented the refreshed medium-term financial plan figures, which was showing a budget gap in 24-25 of around 475,000. We've moved the fair funding review down the line to 26-27, so again, a budget gap in 25-26 of around 800,000. So everything will be moved down the line 12 months, assuming that funding review takes place in 2026-27. So the summary position for 24-25, back in November, we had a budget gap of around 475,000. We had, when we were doing the detailed budget setting, we saw some increased costs coming through from the pay award for next year, assuming that we're going to build in a 4% pay award. The original medium-term financial plan assumed that we were going to be dropping back to maybe a 3% settlement and maybe a 2% settlement the year after. But with 2 years of a pay settlement between 6 and 7%, so only building 3% was going to be looking a little bit light. So we built in a slightly higher pay award increase into the budget for 24-25, but that obviously does have a cost impact. The transfer of public conveniences we talked about at the last meeting when we were talking about the service plans, and obviously the phasing of when those public conveniences transfer over has taken slightly longer than we've originally envisaged in the medium-term financial plans. So that has a cost impact because the original plans would all be transferred over by the 1st of April 2024, including the cleaning of them. That's taken slightly longer than we anticipated, so that will all be done by the end of the financial year, but hopefully during the financial year. We've seen an increase in the external audit fees due to the announcement of the new 5-year contracts. That's increased the audit fees by £90,000. There's been an increase in insurance costs, increase in utility costs. We've also seen a slight reduction in the subsidy we claim back on housing benefit payments. Some of that is to do with the temporary accommodation placements and how much we can claim back on those placements. That does have a cost impact on the council, forms part of that increased cost of temporary accommodation. We talked about reduced parking income. That's been built into the budget for next year as well, and a few other smaller areas. Government funding over and above the original forecast has yielded around about £300,000 credits compared to what we'd originally built into the medium-term financial plan. Adding all that together gave us a budget gap of around about £1 million prior to then looking at ways we could reduce that. So we revisited the budget and challenged some of those assumptions that were built into some of those the draft budget that the team pulled together, and we managed to remove around £400,000 worth of changes in the budget. Some of that was around where some of the assumptions were around some of the government grant changes, so housing benefits, discretionary benefit payments. The grant had been removed. What we haven't done was remove the benefit payments on the other side. We've made assumptions on postal costs going up, but then we're also making ICT changes to the way that we send things out, like the council tax bills, and people can now access their accounts online. So the team had put in some additional costs that we've then revisited. So we've managed to reduce those down by just under £400,000. We still feel they're prudent, and we feel that those assumptions are right moving forwards. But it was right that we went through the detailed budget and made sure that some of those budget assumptions were correct. We've also seen some additional growth in business rates income, so that was increased by a further 250,000 up to the £3 million level. We'd only built in 2.75 million originally. And then due to the timing of some of our capital programmes and also the timing of when we take on the external borrowing, we've reprofiled our borrowing costs. So rather than taking on borrowing in the original timeline, we've managed to move some of that borrowing down the line. That has a benefit to the budget of just under 300,000. And we're also taking another £47,000 from the Treasury Management Reserve. Part of the Q3 report was putting more money back into the Treasury Management Reserve to mitigate our borrowing costs moving forwards. So we have set in the budget to take £47,000 from the Treasury Management Reserve to help smooth those borrowing costs over the next couple of financial years. And then finally, the draft budget assumed using 75,000 of our budget management reserve. We put some money back in the budget management reserve as part of the 43 report that Tony talked about. So the draft budget assumed taking £75,000 from that reserve next year. The medium-term financial plan figures would have then assumed that being a cost the following year, because we only want to take that money once, because using our reserves isn't a way of really balancing the budget ongoing. We only wanted to use it as a one-off use for 24-25. However, the extra funding that's come through last week, as part of the final settlement, yielded about £100,000 worth of extra grant to the authority. So rather than taking 75,000 from the budget management reserve, the extra grant money that's coming as part of the final settlement has meant we don't need to take that 75,000 from the reserve when we bring the final papers to members next Wednesday.
It's worrying, isn't it, at least to me, to find that we needed, before this latest windfall that's going to be here today and gone tomorrow from government, we're going to need to start dipping into reserves to set a balanced budget. That's really worrying.
Yeah, the treasury management reserve is only, is smoothing the effect of the borrowing costs over the next couple of years. So that was coming out anyway, so that wasn't going to be one-off use of that money. So the medium-term financial figures assumed that that was only going to be one-off. The 75,000, yeah, it was going to be sort of using that reserve. And if we didn't find that then for 25-26, that would be the straight cost then of 75,000 starting 25-26 year. So the extra government grant money coming in obviously has, in a sense, mitigated against having to use that. But yeah, quite rightly, that would have been a concern. I think compared to a number of councils, quite a number of councils actually have dipped quite significantly into their reserves to help balance their budgets for 24-25 and did do for 23-24. So 75,000 in the grand scheme of our 15 or 14 million pound budget isn't a large amount, but again, it's not something that we wanted to start doing and start dipping into our reserves to help balance the budget. What we put forward for 24-25 was any increases on things like car park income. When we had the budget workshop, we talked about potentially putting car park fees up in 24-25. So this budget doesn't assume doing that now until 25-26. So obviously, yeah, there are decisions for members to make in terms of addressing the future budget gaps, but obviously the has assumed that we're not putting car park fees up. So that's, Chair, is obviously then.
John, there's 2 or 3, sorry, I'm Councillor Bushell. I had Councillor Bushell about 3 minutes ago, and then I believe Councillor Clayton, and then Councillor Bullitt. Again, is it, John, are you willing to?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we're happy to ask questions now.
Yeah.
Obviously, I've got a number of slides still to go through, but that might answer some
Do
of
you
the
want to
questions.
wait to the end, members?
No, because my head is spinning with the stuff that I've written down here. But John, I know you're good with numbers, and each year I have no idea how you manage to, without cutting services, you manage to balance the books, and it is wizardry. And I have very rudimentary knowledge of business studies and things like that, and we all know that numbers can say anything, and I'm sure that Councillor Jones will correct anything that I've got wrong here. But I'm still stuck around financial settlement. Yeah, so Inner London get 6.7%. They've got far denser areas, so they've got loads more people as well. Yeah, they get way more business rates because there must be more businesses in the centre of London than there are in North Devon. I haven't checked the facts, but I think it's a fair stretch there. But if I lived in Westminster in my little Van B house, I pay a total of £709 council tax. But in South Molton, I pay £1,783. Yeah. Why the government bailing out people in the middle of Westminster when they could just add £1,000 onto their council tax and they'd be paying the same as me? Because they get a bus service that works. I need a car to get to Witheridge in time for work. Otherwise, I've got to be at work an hour and a half early. And we've got this fairer funding, and they've used the word fair, and there is no stretch of the imagination to say it's fairer for somebody in South Molton on a Devon wage, which I'm sure is percentage lower than Inner London, just by the fact they got the banking district there. Pretty sure they can pay more than £709 for a Bambi council tax. But is there any way that the numbers, as a section 151 officer, you can find a way to justify why the government need to give more top-ups to the denser areas per head, which are getting more business rates in, and how the government also doesn't penalise them for not putting their council tax up?
So,
I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but £1,000 extra a year seems, you know, that's.
Councillor Busher, can you just get to your question?
yeah, I think the point though is that the section 151 officer hasn't really got a say on government.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, we understand.
He has,
Say that, you said it for
he
me.
has a better mind than me for figures, and my head is spinning in trying to work out how they've managed to put the word fair and all of these things, I mean, every single model that I'm trying to apply to the numbers, which we're using at the moment.
For sure, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's for John.
But it's because he mentioned that he was writing back to them about the fair and funding.
I'm sorry, but
If I can just say, Jenny, we've written them in terms of a response to the finance assessment in terms of the funding formula in place and obviously our views in terms of that fairness between rural and urban authority. The government funding model, without going into too much intricacies, tries to readdress when business rates are paid. So quite rightly, obviously, there's a lot more businesses in urban areas, in London. They don't get to keep all of those business rates. So the way the business rates model works is billing authorities obviously raise all the business rates, and then there are something called levy and safety nets in place. So even though we bill £34 million worth of business rates, we don't get to keep all of that business rate, sadly. So we pay a levy that goes back into the central model, and then government redistribute that based on quite a complex formula to those authorities that don't collect enough business rates. So we pay a levy. Some of those authorities who don't collect enough business rates, they get a safety net payment in attempts to try and readdress that balance. So the government funding model works in that way to try and redistribute the business rates across the country.
Through the chair, do we think that London is in one of those areas that needs a top up on their business rates levy?
That's what I'm saying. So London, who obviously collect significant level of business rates, won't get to keep all of those business rates. So they will pay a significant levy, which will reduce the amount they'll get to keep. And that levy they will pay will then get distributed across the country to other areas who don't collect as much business rate.
But they're charging less than half the council tax, but the government's giving them more percentage in the grant top up.
That's on the council tax side, but obviously as we alluded to earlier, there are disparities in the funding model in terms of what rural authorities get and what urban authorities get, which has allowed obviously some of the urban areas to maybe have slightly cheaper council tax levels. Well, without getting into politics.
No, but
The model in itself is
less than half.
The model itself has obviously been running for a number of years. The key thing is we have to make representations as part of the consultation settlement. So we've done that on behalf of the council because we felt that this council didn't get as fair a funding as we should have got. So we've made those representations. That's really about as much as we can do. That obviously is tries to be reflected in the final settlement, with obviously additional money coming through the Rural Services Delivery Grant. Has that gone far enough? The answer to that is probably no. That's with my non-political hat on. Obviously, we'll keep lobbying, keep trying to get the fairer funding for the council as next year's settlement comes out and as future years' settlements comes out. I think the key message is that you as a council are putting forward a draft budget that has meant you can put forward a budget without cutting services. We're managing to maintain services. Yes, the draft budget obviously assumed potentially using a small amount of its reserves to balance the budget in 2025, but you're actually putting forward a draft budget to full council now next week that isn't using that money from the reserve and actually is maintaining services at their current levels. So I think from a positive perspective, that is good. We would like to see more funding because then more funding can be reinvested into further services to make them more resilient and potentially provide more capacity for the organisation. But I think that is a further conversation down the road about future settlements.
thank you, John. I'd like to move on there. Was it Councillor Clayton and then Councillor Bullard?
Yeah, thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Just two quick questions, John. On the summary position, I hadn't noticed before the increased utility cost, which is a big whack there, 131,000. So first question, is that just based on the increased price in electricity and gas, or is there, have we got more places that are using utility?
It's actually a bit of both. So some of that is price increase. And some of it is price increase that we've experienced in 23-24 that wasn't built into the 23-24 budget, but we assumed a certain amount and it's come in higher. And obviously then we've made an assumption for 24-25. So in a sense, in that area, there's probably a bit of a double year effect. However, where we increased, have you hit the target? Where we've got the 131,000 increased utility charge there, that was part of the original draft papers the team pulled together. When then we did this challenge down here, a level of that actually came out because what we'd included was actually we somehow were paying for some of the Green Lanes utility costs in the council accounts. The way that charge should have worked was those costs should have been paid for separately by practices who run the asset management for Green Lanes, and that gets recharged out to the tenants. So part of the 131,000, I think it was over half of that then came out as part of this challenge we did down here to say, okay, why are those costs so high? It's quite right. Yeah, so it's about half of
I
that.
thought it seemed a bit like. Second question, you mentioned the recent government extra, is it 100,000?
This one here?
No, sorry, the very recent statement from the government has given us.
Oh, the extra grants, yes.
So
Yeah.
put 75,000 back into the budget.
Yeah.
Management reserve. So where's the other 25 going if you're making a balanced budget?
Yeah, so the additional funds has gone in to bolster the planning enforcement team. So what we've done is not taking the 75,000 from the budget management reserve, and then the overall additional grant, I think, was about 120,000 extra.
Yeah, that was.
So that extra 40 to 50,000 has gone back into planning enforcement. We feel that team needed some additional resource going back into it moving forwards. So planning enforcement has had that resource having back into their establishment.
Well, sorry, Chair, would that be an extra officer then?
That would be an extra officer, yeah.
Thanks.
Councillor Bullock.
Oh, it's only just a quick one again, John. I think you might have answered this already. Where did you get your additional growth in business rates from? Was that because you got more back from central government? Was it?
It's comes from a number of areas. So obviously the rateable values go up. So if there are expanding businesses or new businesses coming into the area, that grows the rateable value base. So that growth, we get to keep 50% of that. Also, there is growth in renewable energy schemes. So, for example, we've got, if you've been on the link road towards Bideford, you've got the solar farm on both sides. When that becomes operational, that will have a positive impact in terms of rateable values, and that we get to keep 100% of those rates. So it's a number of areas where there's been growth in the rateable value base, plus we get to keep a retention from being part of a Devon-wide pool. So we have taken some of that growth in the budget previously. We've now brought that growth up to a more, say, more optimistic level in terms of what we built into the 24-25 budget. So we've seen over the last couple of years, we've reported over and above the budget. We've now started to build that extra level into the budget for 24-25.
So going forward, it looks quite good with our green energy increasing a bit.
It does until 26-27 when the funding review comes in, because then the government are looking to remove all the extra growth on business rates that you've had since 2013 and recirculate that within the system. So as part of that fair funding review, we hope to get a large chunk of that back. But again, we don't know how the government are going to cut up the cake in terms of will we get back what gets taken away, or will we see a reduction in our income? We've prudently assumed a worst case scenario of losing quite a lot of that growth. We hope it's not as bad as that, and we hope actually it comes back and hopefully even be more positive and we get more back than what that's taken away. But we've tried to be as realistic as we can with that forecast.
But they've got to give it to Inner London now, haven't they? Because it's hard times in this.
Right then, John, let's carry on. Thank you.
So moving on from on to council tax, 23-24, this time last year, the council approved an increase of 2.99%. The thresholds for holding referendums were put at 3% or £5 for rural councils. So we have built in a 2.99% increase into the draft budget, which would increase the band D for North Devon by £6.11 for the year. That increased it from £204 up to £210. As you can see from the pound coin, around 3/4 of the council tax actually goes to the county council. So even though we are the billing authority, 3/4 of that actually doesn't come to us, it goes to the county council. Only 9% of the council tax bill actually comes to North Devon Council, and that's our draft £210 that would come to us. So the average council tax bill is £2,400, only 9% of that will come to us. 11% to the Police and Crime Commissioner, 4% to the Fire Authority, and then 4% to your individual town and parish councils. Green Lanes, talked about before, the positive impact that's had for us in terms of our regeneration within the town centre and complementing what we're doing with the other major projects. It has had a positive financial impact as well for the authority. Last 2 financial years has yielded returns of 243,000 for the first 4.5 months of ownership and 291,000 for the 22-23 year. The reason the first year was so high for 4.5 months, because when you look at those numbers, you think, well, why did you get 243,000 in 4 months and you've only got a little bit more for 12 months? There are minimal borrowing costs in the first year, 21-22, because when we bought the centre in November 2021, you don't start charging from an accounting perspective the majority of those borrowing costs until the first full year of ownership, which would happen the year after. So there was a small amount of interest payable, but minimal amounts of actual full borrowing costs. The cash flows for this year and for next year in line with the original business case that we presented to members when we bought the centre. So from a performance perspective, the shopping centre is holding its own and contributing financially back to the authority. So without having their own Green Lanes, obviously that would have been a £300,000 gap in the budget as well moving forwards. So the draft revenue budget, putting that all together, is shown in Appendix A on page 177. That gives you a net budget of 16.3 million. The papers coming to full council next week will show a net budget of about 16.4 million, because obviously the extra £100,000 worth of extra grant income that's come in. So your net budget next week is going to be something like 16.4 something or other. I don't know the exact number, but it'll just put up slightly, because then you'll be showing the extra grant income down here. Of that £16 million net budget, around half of that comes from council tax, 7.6 million. 6.2 million comes from business rates. And then you have a number of other grant aided contributions that come in from government with your funding guarantee grant at the bottom. So that gives you a balanced budget for 24-25 of 16.3. So when it comes to council next week, it'll be about 16.4 million once we've got the updated figures with the final draft, final government settlement. So the assumptions in that budget are that we included a 4% increase on salary costs. That's lower than the average of 6.7% that's been on the salary costs for this year, 23-24. So we've assumed a lower pay award for 24-25. It's assumed 2.99% increase on the council tax, a 5% uplift on most fees and charges. Obviously, there are some outside of that we talked about earlier with the fees and charges report. Garden waste increase from £55 to £60. You've then got a number of strategic grants that we've supported for a number of years. There's no proposed changes in terms of the amount of those grants to the third-party organisations. There is one change in terms of the grants that we give. Gunning North Devon had a grant of 14,720. That business stopped in about 6 months into 23-24. There was a proposal that came to Strategy and Resources for the services that Go North Devon provided, which were a ring and ride service and a shop mobility service, to then be provided by Mid Devon Mobility for the ring and ride element, and Age Concern who provide the shop mobility part. So for 24-25, that 14,720 grant has just been divided into 10,000 Mid Devon Mobility and 4,720 to Age Concern, which equates to the funding they've had for the last 6 months of the 23-24 financial year. You've then got your council and community grants of £1,000 per member, 42,000. So there's no planned reductions to any strategic grants. However, we have look to support those organisations in different ways. We have the CAB, Citizens Advice Bureau, they were based in Linton House when they were struggling for accommodation. So they saved quite significantly on their accommodation cost that they were previously paying. We housed them in Linton House for a few months. So that helped them financially and also benefited us by actually having them next to our services as well. And that's a model we want to replicate moving forwards as part of the new hub proposal that we're looking to do in Green Lanes. North Devon Voluntary Services, again, we give them a grant, but again, we're looking to help them with some software, consultation software that we have. And we're looking to work with them to see whether there's ways we can help them as an organisation rather than them having to tap in and buy software. Maybe that's something that we can help that organisation with as well. And then you've seen the recent PR around the North Devon Community Lottery that has been launched. So that's been launched to the good causes. A couple of weeks ago, we had around 60 good causes organisations joining the official launch at Barnstaple Library. That was really successful. About 20 of those organisations had applied last week. The number's now gone up, and a number of those have actually been approved as good causes. The first draw takes place early April, and ticket sales will go on sale around about the 3rd of February. The North Devon Community Lottery, for each pound that is paid as a ticket, people can then choose which good cause they want their money to go towards. And of their money they choose, 50% of that goes to that good cause. So every pound that somebody buys a ticket, 50% of that ticket price will then go to that good cause. So on a monthly basis, those good causes will then receive that monthly settlement. The remaining 50%, 20% goes towards the prizes for the lottery, 20% goes towards the lottery organisation that are running the lottery for us, and then the remaining 10% comes back to this council as a central fund, which covers some of the overheads and costs we've got in terms of gambling licences and commission fees, and then the remaining amount we look to then distribute out to good causes as well. The grants that are shown there, they're shown in your papers on page 179 in Appendix B. You can want to see more detail on those. In terms of our level of reserves, they're shown in Appendix C on pages 181 and 182. Our general fund balance, which is our sort of working balance, is forecast to be 1.238 million at the end of next year. That equates to about just under 8% of our net budget. Recommended level for this size of authority is between 5 and 10%. So we're on a good level in terms of our general fund balance. Our earmark reserves are at 6.2 million at the end of 2025. That will go up by about 75,000 when we bring the final numbers next week, because we're no longer taking that 75,000 from the Budget Management Reserve. One thing I have to assure you of is, under the Local Government Act, is that those budget estimates in front of you are robust, and that the level of reserves that are set out in your papers are adequate for this size of authority, and I can do that for you. Our medium-term financial strategy moving forwards has been refreshed. Again, those figures have been slightly updated since this has been produced because of the extra grant funding that came in last week. So you'll get an updated version of this that comes to full council next week. Apologies, you've got to sit through the presentation again next week. Sorry, Councillor Clayton, because the second time you've seen it, so it'll be the third time next week. The forecast financial figures obviously show a balanced budget for 24-25, a forecast budget gap of around £500,000 for the year after 25-26. And then because of the fair funding changes and the reset of the business rates, we've assumed about £2 million loss of government funding the year after. We hope it's not as severe as that, and there'll be some transitional protection in place. But again, until that funding review is carried out, we don't know what impact that's likely to have in terms of local authority finance. We have assumed pay rises ongoing. We've assumed 3% for 25-26, and then back to 2% for the years after 26-27. But the sensitivity around every 1% difference in pay review equates to about £180,000. So again, if there was another 6 to 7% pay award for 24-25, that's another £500,000 on next year's budget over and above what we budgeted for. So that's the sensitivity in terms of the pay award in place. It assumes an ongoing increase of 2.99% in the level of council tax, and it has included that 100% premium on second homes in for 25-26 that members took a decision on a couple of meetings ago. Obviously, there's some significant budget gaps moving forwards. fundamental to that would be readdressing how we can plug those gaps. We obviously had the discussions when we had the budget workshop back in the autumn, and there were a number of ideas and discussions around how we could potentially address that. We'll need to bring that forward, readdress and refresh our commercialisation strategy, and look at how we can start to bring some of those ideas forwards that you talked about when we had that workshop back in November. Appendix D just breaks those numbers out in a bit more detail for you. That's on pages 183 and 184. So it shows you how we've arrived at these numbers and how the funding changes over those financial years. So you can see where the funding starts to get removed from the budget 25-26 onwards. That's the revenue budget, Chair. Just a couple of slides to go, you'll be pleased to know. The corporate performance report, Tony talked about the level of capital programme earlier, 36.8 million. And that's set out over the next, this year and the next 2 financial years. That's funded by capital receipts, that we get a few small capital receipts from, but predominantly from borrowing of 15.0818 million, around 19 million pounds of external grants and contributions. So it's quite a significant capital programme, but 19 million pounds of that is coming in from external sources. So that's a very positive message in terms of you're investing 37 million pounds into North Devon, but actually it's only costing you less than 20 million pounds because of that external grants that you're able to take advantage of. It's a fully funded capital programme, and the recommendation to full council next week will be that that capital programme be approved. I won't go into this one too much detail because Adam will talk about treasury management and cash flows and the exciting world of treasury management in the next couple of reports. But what this shows is the level of borrowing that the authority will take on over the next sort of medium to long term. Currently, our external borrowing is forecast to be around about £6 million at the end of this financial year. We don't think we'll need to take on that level of external borrowing at the end of this year now. We're currently borrowing £3 million. At the moment, this model assumed potentially taking on another £3 million by the end of this financial year, and then it increasing up to just over £20 million in 24-25. That's not new borrowing that you haven't obviously approved yet. That's for borrowing that you have previously approved. So things like buying Green Lanes, building a new leisure centre, they've happened a couple of years ago. We just haven't taken on the borrowing for them externally yet, and we're borrowing internally, which is a very cost-effective way of managing the treasury management because we're not taking on the high borrowing cost. We're using our cash reserves, and therefore we're not incurring the interest cost that would bring about with it. We're still making provisions to repay the actual principal borrowing, and that goes in as part of the annual repayment profile. What this shows is that this shows our level of cash and borrowing is that level, that line at the very top. The important thing is that's higher than the blue line, which is our underlying need to borrow. So it demonstrates that we'll have sufficient cash balances to remain in a liquidity perspective moving forwards. There are risks that could affect all of those financial plans I've talked about tonight. They're detailed within your report, at the back of your report. I don't want to go into those in too much detail, but that's the risks around things like government grant income, different moving forwards compared to what we built into the assumptions. Some of the sensitivity around our key areas of income that we receive, savings plans that we've built into the budget, things where we thought there might be some reductions in spend. And also the flip side of that, we've actually seen increase in demand for services such as temporary accommodation. That is a risk to the budget, and potentially if that increases exponentially, that would have an impact within the budget moving forwards. In terms of the timeline, you set the council tax base back in January at your full council meeting. That sets the sort of level of number of properties that we set the council tax on. The draft budget has gone through strategy and resources meeting this time last week. And the minutes from that meeting have been emailed out to you this afternoon. So the discussions we had at strategy and resources that have recommended that budget onto the full council are part of those minutes. Obviously, we're here this evening at the policy development meeting, and your minutes will then go on to full council as well. And then next Wednesday, we have the full council meeting where you'll receive the final budget for approval alongside the formal council tax resolutions for settlement of council tax for each of the town and parish areas. In terms of future options to consider, those budget gaps, obviously we need to bridge. And so we need to take that piece of work that we talked about at the budget workshop for those of you that attended. We need to look at where we potentially could bring about those new opportunities for income coming into the authority. We need to look at that risk to the temporary accommodation and potentially look at acquiring further properties to try and mitigate that risk on the temporary accommodation budget, and also look at ways that we can explore those alternative delivery models for housing. Refresh our commercialisation strategy that was approved a couple of years ago, and make sure that that is updated in line of where we want the authority to go into the medium term. The minute extract and strategy resources I've alluded to, they were finished today, so the minute extract has been emailed out to you this afternoon. That's got the minutes from SNR last week, so they will also go on to full council next Wednesday as well. And Chair, your recommendations in the report on 2.1 and 2.2 on page 160. And that concludes the whistle-stop tour of the budget, Chair.
Thank you, John. I'd like to congratulate you and your team on all the hard work you put into giving us a balanced budget. I'm sure everyone will enjoy it. Thank you. Congratulations.
We'll pass that on to the team. I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
I don't know who stressed you, three wise men.
I was actually going to say something very, very similar to what you actually said. In also moving the recommendations on page 160. Obviously, there'll be some slight variations when it comes to full council, but bearing that in mind, I'd like to move that and to say from myself, thank you very much for being a wizard with regard to managing to get a balanced budget, because I was expecting it to be one in which we would really have had to dip into our reserves this year. It's remarkable that you've been able to come up with what you've prepared for us. So thank you very much, and all the team for your hard work.
Thank you very much. And I'll pass that back through Tony and the team. Like I say, it's been a big team effort, and they'll be very grateful to hear that. Thank you.
Councillor Jones?
Yeah, it's apparent with the shortfalls approaching us, the importance for dynamic, fresh ideas in terms of commercialisation are fundamental. And while we've got a lead member for commercialisation, can you just ask for a short summary of what some of those ideas are and what we're looking at for moving forward to try and close that gap that's approaching us?
Well, the short-term ideas are utilising what we've already got better than we are at the moment. Hence, the idea of moving the customer hub from Milton House to Green Lanes, which will free up space in Lindsay House, which then could potentially be let or something like that, not for space. This is sort of the short-term ideas, and we will be looking at
That was historic, though, wasn't it? Because that was looked at when Green Lane was purchased. It was suggested the possibility. I just wondering if there's any fresh.
It was suggested, but it's now, we've now done the work, well, Jonathan's team have done the work to do that. Now the customer service team have moved up here, so we're now at the point where we can start looking, because until we know, we can't look into what we can do with Linton House, so now we're saying, right, okay, what we're going to do with Linton House, that's our next step in commercialisation. And obviously we will then be looking for ideas of things to come forward from people, from our members and from our staff, as to things that will bring revenue into the authority. We're looking at a housing management company, not a housing company, or it will probably be a bit more than just housing, to take over the running of resources like the units in Badford Street, potentially the leasing of Linton House to other businesses, so that we can bring some of those things in-house, which is going to cost us less than employing external companies to do. And then basically we are looking for suggestions from that from now on for the longer term commercialisation strategy of the council.
Thank you, Councillor Margaret. Thank you. Councillor Bushell?
Yeah, through the chair to whoever you think might answer the question. It sounds like the big idea is this community hub idea and growing it and making it better. I guess that means we think that community hubs are a really good idea and they're good value for our staff.
I think it depends what you mean by community hub. What we're looking at in Green Lanes is a hub for, obviously ourselves, but also wider stakeholder provision in there as well. So like we've seen with Linton House, we had the CAB in with us as well. A lot of the clients who came to the CAB were the same clients who came to visit our services as well. So rather than going to lots of different organisations to come and have your customer dealings dealt with, having it all under one roof makes sense. So what we're looking at in Green Lanes with the empty unit that we've not been able to let, from a retail perspective, it makes more sense to try and use that unit ourselves. So the proposal is that we use the unit next to Poundland, which is the old M&Co unit, and potentially turn that into a council hub, so the council services, but also other third parties. So that potentially brings a revenue stream into the council that wasn't there before, because we're currently paying for that unit as it's an empty unit, it has been since we've acquired the centre. So as it's a cost we're already incurring, any change to that is going to be a financial benefit. So Councillor Walker said, by using that as a wider hub, allows us to get a rental stream from other providers. So that could be a number.
Can I stop you? Because I mean, personally, I think these community hubs are a really good idea. But I get confused when things don't add up. And we've tried these community hubs before, haven't we? Because we have one in South Molton, only without any consultation with the district councillors for South Molton. We've just pulled all the staff out of that. And now we're trying to do it again. Well, if it was broken when we tried it last time, why do we think it's going to work this time? Or was it working last time? Because I think it was working really well in South Molton. Then why did we pull all the funding from South Molton? Because it seems like there are areas which are more deprived than the centre of Barnstaple, which we don't really have a connected bus service to Barnstaple. I'm sure Ilfracombe, Linton will say exactly the same. It really annoys me when we say something's a good idea when it's new, but we've shut it down elsewhere because I don't know, because we weren't consulted. It just happened. It just got taken away from us. And now the following financial year, we're starting it again somewhere else. So why are we penalising the people of South Molton and then trying to run it again in Barnstaple? That's what gets me, because
Bring in Councillor Walker.
really annoys me.
Right, first thing I would like to say is part of the idea of yes, it will be a community hub, but the main idea is to move our public trading council services to somewhere that the public can get to easier.
Well, we did. We had it in Amory House, and it seems like it's being stolen from the people of South Molton and given to different people. And I can't see the justification of taking a hub from one place, putting it in another, because it either worked where it was, or the idea of community hub doesn't work. It either works or it becomes.
Sorry, I have to finish speaking. Basically, as I said, the idea is to move it to somewhere that people can get to. People can't get to Linton House. It's a horrible place to get to. It's completely inaccessible for anybody who has anything more than minor walking issues, unless you've got a very expensive wheelchair. And it just makes our service more, the service that we are already providing in one place, we are talking about moving it to another place. We have had other organisations who are interested in joining us in that space.
That's good, but for the people of South Molton, it doesn't matter whether it's in Linton House or Green Lanes. It's really hard for them to get from South Molton. It is. We're setting up a hub, which we're going to trial and work somewhere else. We shut it down and leave it somewhere else.
The decision South Molton was down, it wasn't down to we're just removing the new resource, it's down to how much demand was there. And also the level of service that was provided in South Molton by the North Devon Council reception was actually covering, in a sense, services for the town council as well. So we weren't just providing North Devon Council services. So there were town council provision there as well from the officer who was based in South Molton. So they're not just providing North Devon Council services. So we have to look at where the demand is, and what demand there is on North Devon Council services. Now, obviously, the team have looked at that in discussions, obviously, with the town clerk, at South Molton, around the level of resource that would then be deployed at South Molton. So obviously, if there are wider than North Devon Council services being funded, that is obviously a discussion that takes place then with the town council around obviously how that is resolved as well. So obviously, we don't just reduce because we feel as though we need to reduce the resources. It's down to when the demand is on North Devon Council services. And obviously, there are certain days in South Molton when it's busier than others, but we couldn't maintain a level of service where demand in North Devon Council services wasn't at the level where it justified having resource in that area.
Thank you, John.
It might be nice to consider the
Councillor Bushell,
councillors for the area rather than just the town.
Councillor Clayton,
I assume that would have been done through the town
can it
council.
be quite brief, because we need
Yeah,
to
thanks,
go
Chair.
down.
I sympathise with what Councillor Bush was saying, but at the end of the day, North Devon services, a lot of them are provided in the Barnstable area, and that's where the offices are. I think moving from Linton House to this one-stop centre where the majority of residents who can go in there can actually go and speak to a council officer face to face, not being distant as they have been previously, is a fantastic move forward. I hope it's really successful. That's not to say we shouldn't be pioneering it in other areas as well. Ilfracombe has its own one-stop place. Now, South Molton recently has been promoting the fact that they've not actually increased the council tax. They've actually decreased it, the precepts. Now,
We've done that because we've got
That's
an award-winning planning market.
So that's one,
Re-commercialisation.
but that's one way forward perhaps, that you could have some
Conversation.
one-stop council officer presence by perhaps increasing the precepts or perhaps they're working with North Devon. Just a possibility. I think it should be everywhere, but you've got to admit that this is a great move forward for North Devon, and it's going to be much better and much easier. for
Sorry,
residents.
Chair, we are so far away from the original subject of this report. We were miles away and then we moved to a different
Yes,
planet.
it's not easy, okay, with some factors. Members, we'd now like to go to the vote, and it's been proposed and seconded that we recommend to full council all the recommendations in 2.2.
2.1 and
2.1 and 2.2, Chair.
2.1 and 2.2.
Is both,
Oh, sorry, yeah, both recommend.
both of them, yeah. Oh, I think 2.1 is no, 2.2 is recommended full council,
So 2.1 is obviously,
for us to note.
and then 2.2 is what you're recommending on
Oh,
2.4.
yeah.
Voting on both.
Yeah. All in favour, members, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Now we move on to item 9, and I think that's
Mr. Civil.
is that you?
Very, very
Of course it is, of course it is, Adam. Of course it is, sorry.
Bit of light relief for everyone. In the previous items on the agenda, consider the capital programme for the next few years. The Treasury strategy really looks at the impact of those capital plans on our borrowing, our investments over the same period. And I'll just take you through a couple of the key points within the report. The second table on page 199 shows the net financing need for the current and the next 3 financial years. This is the shortfall in funding to finance the approved capital programme, resulting in a borrowing need. You'll note for 24-25, this is estimated to be 8.9 million, with a further 2.7 million shortfall the following year. The total historic outstanding borrowing need to finance the capital programme is known as the Capital Financing Requirement, or the CFR. This is the key measure of the council's underlying need to borrow. The projections for the CFR are shown on the top of the table on page 200. This financial year is projected to be 27.6 million, increasing to 39 million in 25-26. The amount of borrowing actually undertaken to finance the CFR will depend on the amount of year-end resources and reserves we're expecting to have. In the current economic environment, still prove to use some of these resources to meet the borrowing need rather than going to PWLB. You'll see on the table on page 202 that we're projecting that our own funds and reserves will allow us to offset borrowing by 22 million this year and 15 million next year, which is our internal borrowing. So our borrowing need less any internal borrowing is the amount we actually need to borrow externally. External borrowing, as John's already said, is projected to remain at 3 million this financial year, but then increase by 20.5 million over the next 3 financial years. However, we've seen in previous years, any slippages to the capital programme can result in delaying the external borrowing. In 2021, we signed up to a leasing agreement for our vehicle fleet replacement. Once these costs increase the CFR, these schemes have their own borrowing facility from the lease provider. So this is in addition to the borrowing from the PWLB and is shown as long-term liabilities on the report. This borrowing is projected to be just over 5 million next financial year. There are 2 key borrowing indicators on page 206, the operational boundary, which is the expected limit of external borrowing, and also the authorised limit, which is the maximum amount of borrowing we can undertake. The Link Group interest forecast has been provided for you on page 207. Bank rate now stands at 5.25%, and they believe this has peaked, and we're expecting small cuts as inflation and other economic data allow. We'll continue to work closely with our Treasury advisors to keep rates under review and access the optimum time for borrowing. Our investment strategy is covered on your agenda from pages 113. We're not proposing any changes to the way in which we make our investments, being guided by the credit worthiness service of our Treasury advisors in terms of who we should be investing with and how long. We then set financial limits on those investments as shown on page 207 and on appendix A to the report. As always, our approach will be security of funds, then liquidity before we consider the yield. I'd now like to refer members to recommendation in 2.1 of the report.
Thank you. I don't, John, yeah, councillor Petrinus.
I always find it really difficult to ask questions about adults reports because they're very could say comprehensive and incomprehensible. So I'd like to move recommendations.
Seconded.
Yeah, technically. I'd like to ask a question.
Okay, councillor.
Because I feel like I haven't had any questions for any of these reports, and I would think for him to think that I wasn't giving him the opportunity to demonstrate his wider knowledge, which I do know is there. No, I mean, my questions around this link group, because I know nothing about them, but what I do know is every time the Bank of England do something with interest rates, it's always a shock that. So how do we know if from one month to the other, it's a shock that they kept it the same, it's a shock it went up, it's a shock it went down? How do they calculate these if nobody seems to know from one month to the next? How can we go to 2027?
I think, the Link Group would be the first to say this is based on their estimated view.
Who are
of what
they?
will happen.
And what
They are,
I mean, who are they? Who are the people who are there linking?
they are our external Treasury advisors, so there's various companies you can go with. These are the ones that council have been with for a long time, have got a good working relationship with them. So in that sense, they sit down within their group, at least quarterly, to review their interest rate forecast. Obviously, they're guided by the MPC and their decisions as much as we are. They also look at capital economics for their views. They don't just take their own views. So we've got a selection of data that we can choose from, but they would be the first to say that their interest rate forecasts are just that. It is their forecasts, and before the banking crash and things like that, obviously that comes a shock to them as much as anybody else. So they are there for your information. They guide myself and John in terms of those investment decisions when we think about borrowing, but they need to be seen in that context.
Yeah, John, can you explain why it's a shock to everybody who's a forecaster when it comes on the news?
It's not.
No, but they always say it's a shock, it's staying the same, it's a shock that is a change. It's a shock that we've gone into recession, or, you know, how could we do 5 years worth or 3 years? That's what I don't get,
They're economists, and obviously we've got two, without going into too much detail, there really are two major players who do treasury advisory services. We use Link, there is another one. But it's based on, it is a crystal ball exercise at the end of the day. And obviously they have looked at the economy, they've looked at previous trends. We tend to know what happens with the economic cycle. So they review that and they take into account a number of factors that then gives this projection. But again, it gets updated next time round. But there are experts, far more expertise than myself and Adam in terms of the treasury. That's why we outsource it to them. If we had to sit and try and work out what we thought was going to happen with interest rates, we could be here for quite some time. So we trust the expert treasury advisors to provide that. But it's not just one person sat there with a crystal ball. There are a number of economists and lots of other data that goes into this calculation about how they're projecting moving forwards based on previous economic activity and based on what they've learned from previous cycles that they've seen.
And the short-term previous interest rates have been well below inflation. So any borrowing that we did for, so the leisure centre has been eroded to at least some degree by inflation. How do we see inflation against these interest payments? Because while inflation is higher than the interest, that's a good thing. If that drops, it could have a negative effect. So, Adam, how do you see inflation versus our borrowing going forwards? If that's not too much of a left field question to ask you off the cuff.
Yeah, so I'm no expert, I'm not here in terms of the inflation. Again, we would look to our Link advisors who are suggesting that the trends are going down, and that will take the pressure off the interest rates that we get as well. So again, if you look at some of the interest rate projections on the PWLB borrowing, they are seeing those coming down because Bank of England will, in a sense, be able to reduce the bank rate. That's what we're hoping. That will then have the knock-on on borrowing rates. So in some ways, what we've done over the last couple of financial years is try to do that internal borrowing, try to reduce external borrowing in the hope that when we do have to get there, that the borrowing rates will come down. As John said, we've got the Treasury Management Reserve set up to just smooth that effect on the base.
Yeah, I think just to add that also, when we built the leisure centre, when we took it to members for approval, the modelling was based on us borrowing between 3 and 3.5%. So that was based on where we were borrowing a few years ago. Right, interest rates did come down. We actually took on some external borrowing that was sub 2%. So we actually took that on at an optimum time. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. If we knew what was going to happen, then we'd have taken on a significantly amount, a lot more, sub 2%. But even taking on borrowing that much cheaper, if you don't need to borrow, then there's a cost to holding that money, because ultimately we'd rather get an investment return and put that money back into our reserve, which is what we've done. And having a Treasury Management Reserve that's got £500,000 worth of benefit from not taking on borrowing because we put that into a reserve means that actually if we have to take a couple of years at 3.5%, 4%, the Treasury Management Reserve is going to be far better using that to reduce that borrowing cost. And then when interest rates hopefully do get down to the sort of 3%, less than 3% at some point, then hopefully we're borrowing at the level that we originally built into that model originally. So it's about playing that game of making sure you take the borrowing at the right time. And we're not going to take too much borrowing whilst borrowing is expensive at the moment. But any borrowing we do take will be offset by the fact we've got the Treasury Management Reserve, and then we'll take it when borrowing rates do come down a bit cheaper.
Chair, very interesting, but can I move 2.1?
It's been moved.
You can, but I was going to ask about the difference in the length of how it works, or do we decide that at the point that we need the borrowing? Because you get different rates across the different spans.
Yeah.
At the time you take the borrowing, you choose the length.
Thank you both for answering those questions. Great, thank you. All those in favour of the recommendation, please. Thank you, members. And finally, You go to the 10-year capital strategy.
Again, just a brief one there.
Thank you.
The aim of the 10-year capital strategy is to take that long-term view on the financial stability of the council and provide members with the financial context for making future capital decisions. The report is broken down into two timeframes. First, in the medium term, which has been largely covered off in previous items on the agendas. Secondly, the long term, which we look at years 28-29 to 33-34. And we've identified on the top of page 230 the ongoing financial commitments, such as replacing our vehicle fleet after their asset life. So if we look at that period and extend our financial projections, including the additional expenditure items, we can start to look at the impacts of our long-term funding. You'll see from the table on page 231, CFR, or underlying need to borrow capital programme, is projected to remain at a high level, although decreasing from 36 million 28-29 to 30 million 33-34. In the same way, our PWOB borrowing is forecast to reduce, but will remain over 19.5 million over that long-term period. Clearly, there is a cost to external borrowing, whether that's through the PWOB or the finance leases, which is a hit to the council's revenue budget. This cost is set to remain at circa 3 million a year over that period, which will continue to add pressure to the budget gap. And that assumes a break-even capital programme after 25-26. So any further capital expenditure approved, which is not fully funded, and will increase the borrowing projections and therefore the borrowing costs within the strategy. Again, happy to refer members to the recommendations.
Yeah, Adam. Are you moving the recommendation, councillor?
I'll second.
Seconded.
No, hang on. You didn't have a proposer there because I didn't say yes. So.
Second. I'll let him speak. He has got a gentleman.
If there's questions, Chair.
Chair, he has got a question.
No, we're not allowing questions. You said that, nah, fuck it.
Chair.
No, don't worry, we're not.
If there's questions, Chair, you should plenty of time for questions and all the rest of it.
That language.
Could I ask you to conduct yourself properly in the job that you're doing then? Adam, you said that
I think this is out of order.
capital projects needed to be fully funded, otherwise there would be more borrowing, and that the borrowing was going to drop from 36 million to 30 million. Where do you think, and rest at 19 million for the foreseeable, where would you think would be sensible to keep the borrowing? Would you be thinking that we shouldn't borrow anymore? Or is there going to be headroom in the future?
I suppose the purpose for this report is to just set that context for you as members when you get your next financial capital decisions to make, that you're aware of that long-term position. Yeah, there is pressure on the council's budget. There are long-term borrowing there. That's not to say that, you know, if you're looking at a capital decision and there'll be future receipts or future income, they'll offset that borrowing, and that might not be a good decision to take. This report is about setting that financial context and raising your awareness, I suppose, of the approved capital schemes and the impact that will already have.
So we should be cautious before taking on any more borrowing. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
We can have the vote now if you wish.
Sorry, can
We can have the vote now if you wish, if we haven't already.
I poster, please?
Yeah.
Second, everything in favour? Thank you very much. And thank you, the gentlemen.
Chair, thank you, members.
Very helpful.
Sorry, Chair, with this work programme still.
Did they speak?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought they might like to go. Yeah.
And so how long are you going to be with the work program?
Item 11, members, is the work programme for 23-24. I think there may be a suggested amendment. Did you want to say anything, councillor Bullard?
Yeah, just on the agricultural bit,
Yeah.
saying that we had a meeting and we discussed it and we thought March was an inappropriate time of the year. With discussing agriculture and farmers are busy lambing, calving, trying to till some ground in the mud. We'd like to do it end of April, mid-May at the latest. That's all there.
So,
Sorry, I didn't let you finish your point.
I think,
Oh, and we listed the people as well.
And we've listed the people we want and now we're going to contact those people to see what they're.
right,
But I'm happy to come forward and then we'll give you a list of, give Kelly a list of who to contact and we like to, like with the water thing, we like to do it in petrol, if possible. That's it.
I'm just new
councillor Jones.
to the committee. Obviously, the items that we're looking at, comes to an end in March. When do we get an opportunity to consider items for next year moving forward?
We did, it was, I can't remember what month it was. John, that we did, and we've got about 11 or 12, that sort of brainstorming session we had.
So we had a brainstorm and John decided.
Yeah.
No.
No, I think what it was there were more independents at the meeting, so we just voted through the things that we wanted to do because there weren't enough Liberals there.
No, Chair, there was, as I recall, there was a workshop with all the members invited.
That's right.
And there was a whole range of subjects came up, where we realised we couldn't do all of them because there was like 10 or 12. And we've seen already how difficult it is and how intent, I mean, Kelly has to do shed loads of work behind the scenes to try and get one meeting together.
Yeah.
And as we'll find out on the 29th, when we do the workshop, it's going to be quite, intensive. Then we're going to have to carry work on from that. And then we're going to have to do the agriculture one, then we're going to do the dentistry one. But certainly, I would imagine that sometime around the agriculture one, because we've got the dentistry one coming after that, we ought to have another workshop so we can think, identify the most pressing issues to follow on.
Yeah, I think that would be, President.
Just a very, very turbo summary of where we are, particularly those of you who just joined us. So in terms of 29th of February, hopefully it is in everyone's diaries. Hoping to see a lot of the senior leadership team there as well, we hope. We had a meeting this afternoon. We had so many questions, and then it became apparent we only actually have a certain amount of time. So what we did was we grouped all those questions up and they broke into 5 different subjects. So we have basically created 5 subjects. What we'll do is we will there's a question associated with each of those subjects based on what we will put forward. That will go in advance to those experts that are joining us. And we're asking them to provide answers in advance, which we will then review prior to the meeting. That will then give us the opportunity to dive deeper into the subject and cross question. If we just go in at we don't want to stay at the sort of the base level where media is covering. We want to dive deeper and get some real answers. So we'll get all those answers back, and then we'll be able to ask further questions on the evening. The public are being asked also to send in questions, which would be, we'll save a slot of 30 minutes. We'll obviously have to be selected. But that's where we are. Marketing is going out. The PR team is producing something for us, which is really kind.
Going out tomorrow, I think.
And Kelly, a huge thank you, because I know the amount of work you put into this.
Exactly.
Even if it's just shepherding us a lot of the time. So big thank you.
Chasing people and.
That was it.
So will we, in this group, have a chance to see those questions before the meeting?
So we will send, tomorrow,
Yes, so, thank you. Okay, is that okay?
Yes.
So I sent the draft questions out to councillors Spear, Trinos and Jones this afternoon, just waiting for their comments to come back. I've just saw that before I locked out, just to see if I'm on the right track with everything. If everyone's happy with those, I will then send those out to the invited analysts that are coming to the meeting with a deadline of them responding sometime next week, so that we've got time then to look as well. And then obviously additional questions will be asked at the meeting, and we have the public as well. I've given them, they're going to go out and given them a deadline for 22nd to come back with the questions.
Yeah.
So does that mean we're not going to see the questions? Until tomorrow?
But just for clarity, there isn't, the questions have been condensed down to 5 questions.
Yes.
On 5 key subjects, but then you will ask questions on the evening.
Yeah.
Detailed questions.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Still what you'll find.
Yes. Yes.
So can I just clarify one thing? Well, what's going to happen is, so we'll send out these 5 broad questions. All the various organisations will respond, and those questions and responses will be on the agenda. So not only can we all see everything, you know, obviously in advance, but the too. And then when it comes to it, we can say, hang on, you said this and they said that. But why didn't it happen in this river at that time?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, you know, something specific that we can try and tease out the things we can helpfully do.
So, I mean, having had this session and these insightful questions and helpful responses to them, will at the following meeting, is that when we'll look at those responses and look at developing policy that we can then recommend to the council or recommend to other committees?
Well, yeah, we're then going to follow. We haven't actually documented this, but it was my understanding of the way we discussed it, exactly that we will need to include it on the agenda at future policy meetings to then discuss those findings and what we can proactively do. I personally don't want to waste my time on this unless we're actually going to do this as well. Yeah. But we have to be realistic that as a council with limited resource, that there is a limit to what we can do. And I know there will be things we can.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, members. I formally close the meeting. It's gone 9 o'clock. Sorry about that, but it's our major one of the year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.